Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The night sky hangs clear and cold tonight, the aurora dancing green above the peaks, and I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some tales to share, ones that you may like. Tonight is a long one, traveler, for I mean to tell you the whole story of this world, from before there was a world at all, down to these very days when the dragons have returned to our skies. Settle in beneath the firs and let the fire keep you. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Long before there were kings in Skyrim, long before there were snows to fall upon it, long before there was even ground for the snow to touch, the lore masters tell of a state they name the Void. To speak of it plainly is difficult, traveler, for there was no time in which it sat, and no place in which it rested. The Void simply was, and it was empty, and it went on without measure, in every way that a thing can go on. The Nords who first told these tales, gathered around fires much like this one, called it the Great Nothing that came before the world. Out of this emptiness, two forces stirred. The first was Anu, and the mystics of the Somerset Isles describe him as the soul of stasis, of order, of light, and of permanence. Anu was the impulse that wished all things to remain, to hold their shape, to endure without ending. Where Anu spread himself, things settled into stillness and kept their form. The second force was Padome, and he was the opposite of his brother in every respect. Padome was the soul of change, of chaos, of darkness, and of motion. Where Anu wished all things to stay, Padome wished all things to become something else, to break and to shift, and to never once hold still. The Old Mary scholars call these two the eternal opposites, and they say the whole of existence sprang from the friction between them. Now, the two forces moved through the void, and in their movement they touched one another. Here the myths part ways, for different peoples tell it differently, and I will tell you that no mortal was present to witness it, so each culture guards its own version. The elves of Somerset speak of a third thing called Near, a presence that arose between Anu and Padome, and both forces are said to have loved her. Near gave shape to the possibility of things, and around her the first stirrings of creation began to gather. From the meeting of these two forces, something new took form. Where Anu and Padome overlapped, where order pressed against chaos, and chaos pressed back, there came into being a swirling middle region. The lore masters call this region the Abyss, and they also call it the Grey Maybe, for it was neither the pure light of Anu nor the pure dark of Padome. The Abyss was the mixture of the two, and it churned and turned within itself, holding both stillness and motion at once. Within the Abyss, each of the two eternal forces gave rise to a soul that carried its nature forward. From Anu came Anuiel, and Anuiel was the soul of all that is ordered, the living expression of permanence given a name and a will. Anuiel held within himself everything that Anu wished to preserve. The mystics say that to look upon Anuiel, if such a thing were possible, would be to look upon the pattern of all things that endure. From Padome came Sithis, and Sithis was the soul of all that is chaos, the living expression of change and of ending. Sithis held within himself the urge to unmake, to dissolve every shape back into the churning nothing. Where Anuiel wished to hold, Sithis wished to break, and so even within the Abyss, the two natures continued their eternal disagreement, one building order and the other tearing it apart. The turning of the Abyss, the endless mixing of Anuiel and Sithis, produced something the lore masters find hard to describe. As the two souls churned against one another, fragments of awareness began to condense. These fragments were the first flickers of self, the earliest seeds of what would one day become gods and demons and the ancestors of all living things. They gathered like frost forming on a cold window, slowly, piece by piece, out of the swirling grey. I should tell you, traveller, that the wise of Tamriel argue over all of this to this very day. The Nords tell it one way, the High Elves another, and the priests of the temples tell it a third. Some say Anu is good and Padome is evil, plain as that. Others say such words as good and evil mean nothing at this scale, for there were no mortals yet to be helped or harmed. What remains agreed upon across the provinces is that two forces met, that their meeting made the Aurbis, and that from the Aurbis all else would follow. You may find it strange to hear a story that has no clear beginning and no firm ground beneath it. That is the nature of these oldest tales. They come from a time the lawmasters call the dawn, when nothing yet held its shape for long, and even the telling of it shifts, depending on whose fire you sit beside. Yet every one of those tellings agrees on this much, that from the empty void came Anu and Padome, and from their meeting came the mixing that would cradle everything to come. For within that swirling grey, those first flickers of awareness were still gathering and growing. They would soon take names and take shape, and they would soon do a thing that had never been done in all the emptiness that came before. They would give birth to time itself, and with time, the whole slow story of the world could at last begin to unfold, one moment following the next, in the manner you and I know so well. Within the churning grey mist of the Arbis, heavy clouds of vapour crashed into sharp fragments of crystal. The collisions produced blinding flashes of white light and deep shock waves that rippled through the thick atmosphere. This dense central region formed the beginning place, a concentrated mass of energy where temperatures fluctuated rapidly between blistering heat and freezing cold. The raw matter of the universe spun in a violent vortex, throwing off sparks and solidifying into massive boulders of jagged rock. The pressure in this space squeezed the dust and the light together, forcing the scattered elements into tighter formations. From these compressed pockets of matter, the original spirits, the Etida, slowly crystallized. Dust particles fused into shining metallic structures. Shards of ice melted into thick, glowing liquids that flowed upward and hardened into standing columns. These columns grew branches, and the branches sprouted grasping appendages with articulated joints. Luminous spheres opened across their surfaces, serving as eyes that darted rapidly to observe the surrounding chaos. The spirits pulled more matter into themselves, adding layers of stone, vapor, and fire to their growing bodies. They shifted constantly, their limbs melting into puddles of light and reforming into wings of spun glass. The violent currents of the Orbis tore at their unfinished shapes, scattering their pieces back into the storm. Out of the brightest cluster of white energy, a massive figure took a permanent, solid form. This was Ori-El, the soul born directly from the concentrated light of Anui-El. He grew tall, his skin composed of hardened gold plates that radiated waves of blistering heat. Sharp, angular features defined his face, and enormous wings of white flame erupted from his back, casting long, stark shadows across the surrounding mist. Ori-El raised his arms, and a shock wave of golden energy expanded outward from his chest. With this sudden release of energy, Ori-El established a steady, rhythmic pulse. The light flared brightly, dimmed, and then flared again at an exact interval. The sound of a heavy, echoing strike accompanied each flash of light. One continuous beat followed another, sending rhythmic vibrations through the grey vapor. The chaotic, swirling mist caught the vibration and began to flow in a single, straight direction. The vapor moved steadily forward, aligning with the beating pulse. The scattered rocks and crystals drifted along this linear current, leaving glowing trails behind them to mark their previous positions. The spirits looked ahead, tracking the objects moving forward along the straight path. Time manifested as a physical current, carrying everything in one uniform direction. Caught within this steady current, the turbulent Arbis stabilized. The tearing winds calmed into a gentle, continuous breeze. The Etada held their shapes together, anchored by the rhythmic pulsing of the light. A spirit with wings of silver folded its appendages, and the wings remained intact. Another spirit, appearing as a sphere of shifting green fire, hardened its outer crust into a smooth, solid shell. They touched their newly formed faces, tracing the ridges of bone and the curves of crystal. They opened their mouths and produced distinct sequences of sounds, vocalizing their names into the flowing air. They placed their heavy feet onto floating platforms of rock, leaving deep indentations that remained visible in the stone long after they stepped away. Hundreds of divine beings took shape across the expanse. Massive, serpentine bodies coiled around pillars of light. Tall humanoid figures, draped in robes of woven mist, marched along the linear currents. Creatures with multiple heads and jagged horns clashed against one another, their impacts sending showers of sparks drifting down the steady stream of time. They observed each other with their newly opened eyes, recognizing the consistent forms of their neighbors. They gathered in distinct clusters, drawn together by matching colors of light and similar physical structures. As the spirits moved along the current, the gray mist of the Arbis separated into distinct, massive regions. The lighter, brighter vapors rose to the outer edges of the expanse and ignited. This perimeter became Ethereus, a realm defined by sheets of blinding white flame, rivers of pure, burning light, and floating islands of solid, polished gold. The heavier, darker matter sank into the deep gaps between the pockets of light. These chasms formed oblivion, filled with swirling pools of black water, freezing storms of sharp ice, and jagged obsidian spikes jutting from the dark voids. Between the burning heights of Ethereus and the freezing depths of oblivion, a vast, spherical hollow opened in the very center of the Arbis. The grey mist pulled away from this middle point, scraping against the edges and leaving a massive, empty space. The steady current of time flowed directly through this central quiet zone. The space sat open, an immense pocket of stillness positioned in the exact center of the swirling cosmic storm. Through the stabilizing currents of the Arbis, a massive entity composed of shifting black ash and burning red embers pushed against the steady stream of light. This spirit carried the name Lorcan, and his body continuously crackled with the dense, chaotic energy of Sithis, while the other crystallized spirits aligned themselves with the rhythmic pulse of time. Lorcan moved perpendicularly across the straight paths. He approached the golden and silver beings, dragging a heavy trail of dark vapor behind him. Consequently, the shining entities halted their march, turning their glowing eyes toward the ash-covered figure. Lorcan stopped in the center of the gathering and opened his mouth, emitting a series of low, vibrating tones. As he vocalized, Lorcan raised his hands and projected a physical model constructed of swirling dust, gray water, and sharp fragments of bone. He held this miniature model up for the other spirits to observe, pointing directly toward the spherical hollow situated in the exact center of the orbis. He manipulated the dust and water, shaping it into a dense, solid globe. Furthermore, he arranged a series of glowing rods radiating outward from the central globe, connecting it to a larger outer ring of light. He presented this wheel-shaped structure to the assembly, demonstrating how the outer ring would turn around the heavy, solid center. He communicated the construction of Mundus, a new physical plane composed of dirt, liquid, and finite matter. In response to the demonstration, a spirit woven from rushing wind and green light stepped forward. She carried the name Kinnereth, and she immediately expanded her chest, drawing in a massive volume of the surrounding grey mist. She exhaled forcefully, directing a continuous stream of heavy wind directly into the central hollow of the orbis. Her breath scoured the edges of the hollow, pushing the chaotic vapors further back and establishing a perfectly smooth, spherical boundary of empty space. Subsequently, Auriel approached the newly formed boundary. The golden plates of his skin flared with heat as he extended his wings, projecting his steady, rhythmic pulse into the empty sphere. He laid down the tracks of linear time across the hollow space, ensuring the dust and water would move in strict sequence. With the space cleared and the pulse established, a third prominent spirit advanced toward the center. This entity, radiating bright blue and white light, answered to the name Magnus. He manifested a series of glowing geometric lines from his fingertips, projecting triangles, octagons, and overlapping circles into the empty sphere. Magnus aligned these angles with the edges of Kinnereth's boundary, calculating the exact mass and density required to build Lorcan's model. He plotted the specific trajectories for the celestial bodies, mapping the exact curves where the rock and water would settle. He constructed a massive framework of intersecting rings, weaving cables of solid white light to serve as the foundation for the dirt and water. His light hardened into physical girders, creating a scaffolding that spanned the entire width of the central hollow. Magnus functioned as the architect, locking the raw materials into precise mathematical patterns. The remaining spirits gathered at the edge of Kinnereth's boundary, observing the spinning framework. Lorcan stood near the center, gesturing for the beings to enter the structure. The assembly divided into two distinct groups. The first group stepped over the boundary and descended into the intersecting rings. As they touched the cables of white light, they poured their own liquid energy and solid crystal directly into the framework. They fused their bodies to the structure, solidifying the dust into heavy earth and turning the grey water into deep oceans. Observers on the outside pointed at these builders and vocalized the sound Aedra, linking them to the physical creation. Meanwhile, the second group of spirits halted at the perimeter. They gripped their glowing matter tightly to their chests, turned their backs on the central sphere, and propelled themselves outward. They flew away from the framework, diving into the freezing, jagged chasms of oblivion. There, they wove their own isolated domains out of black water, obsidian spikes, and freezing ice, keeping their energy contained entirely within their own shapes. They constructed towering spires of jagged rock and rivers of dark sludge, sealing the borders of their territories to prevent any of their light from spilling into the spinning wheel. The observers vocalized the sound Daedra, designating them as the entities who separated themselves from the construction. Back at the edge of the newly forming world, Lorcan displayed two distinct physical behaviors as he watched the Aedra pour their energy into the framework. On one side, he observed the bodies of the builders shrinking, the gold plates on their skin tarnished, their crystal wings dulled, and their limbs grew heavy and sluggish. As their light dimmed, Lorcan curled his ash-covered lips upward, his red eyes narrowing in a prolonged stare. Simultaneously, he raised his right arm and pointed directly upward, aiming his finger past the central sphere, past the burning edges of Aetherius, toward a distant, brilliant white point of light located outside the orbis entirely. He projected an image of the shrinking spirits climbing out of the heavy dirt, using the solid ground as a physical platform to launch themselves toward that higher light. The physical construction of the world continued rapidly, pulling more and more energy from the builders as the heavy dirt compressed tightly around their fading forms. The spirits on the inner rings of the framework pushed their hands into the spinning structure of dirt and water. As they transferred their light into the rocks and oceans, a physical change overtook their bodies. The glowing vapor that made up their limbs thickened into heavy, dense flesh. Their shimmering crystal wings cracked and shattered, falling away in jagged shards that dissolved into the oceans below. The golden plates on their skin oxidized, turning brown and green as layers of rust spread across their surfaces. They dropped to their knees on the newly formed crust of the sphere, their movements slowing as the immense weight of gravity pulled them downward. The dirt and water compressed tightly around their lower halves. Their legs fused with the cooling magma and settling silt. As more of their light poured into the center, the temperature of their bodies dropped. Frost gathered on their shoulders, and their breath, once a stream of pure fire, condensed into thick clouds of gray steam. The framework required continuous energy to maintain its shape, and it drew this energy directly from the vital essence of the builders, draining the heat and light from their forms in steady, visible waves. Magnus stood on a platform of hardening obsidian and observed the fading light of his fellow spirits. He looked at his own hands, watching the bright blue and white light flicker and dim beneath a growing layer of gray soot. He ceased channeling his energy into the mathematical grid. He bent his knees, pushed off the obsidian platform, and propelled himself upward. He accelerated through the heavy atmosphere, trailing a wake of displaced clouds, and aimed directly for the outer boundary of the central sphere. Magnus struck the dense, dark canopy of the sky with the full force of his remaining light. The impact shattered the canopy, ripping a massive, jagged circular hole through the barrier. Magnus passed through the rupture and disappeared into the burning white expanse of Aetherius. Behind him, the edges of the rupture glowed white-hot, and the blinding light of Aetherius poured continuously down through the opening. This massive tear illuminated the swirling dust and oceans below, casting sharp shadows across the new terrain. The light carried raw, unfiltered magic, and it flooded the atmosphere, striking the ground in crackling waves of blue energy that scorched the newly formed rock. Seeing Magnus escape the draining sphere, a large group of other spirits ceased their building and followed his trajectory. They launched themselves into the sky, striking the canopy in a scattered sequence of impacts. Carrying less mass than Magnus, they punched much smaller holes through the dark barrier. Thousands of tiny, glowing punctures spread across the canopy. The spirits passed through into Aetherius, leaving these fractures open. Thin beams of starlight shone down through the punctures, adding narrow streams of magical energy to the heavy atmosphere of the physical plane, and dotting the dark ceiling with points of intense white light. Other spirits remained trapped within the gravitational pull of the new world. 8 of the most massive beings pulled away from the surface of the sphere, but lacked the momentum to pierce the sky. They drifted outward, settling into the empty space between the physical ground and the dark canopy. To survive the continuous drain on their energy, they folded in on themselves. Their limbs and faces collapsed into massive spherical masses of dormant matter. They became 8 separate globes of rock, gas, and ice, orbiting the central world in slow, elliptical paths. They locked their energy into these spherical domains, maintaining their presence while keeping their remaining light insulated from the pulling surface below. From the surface of the central world, these 8 domains appeared as large, glowing celestial bodies hanging against the dark void of the canopy. On the ground, the spirits who had given the most energy lost all capacity for movement. Their feet sank deeply into the cooling crust. Bark and thick moss grew over their legs, locking their joints in place. Their vocal cords snapped, emitting loud cracks that echoed across the forming valleys. Their fingers elongated into tangled root systems that dug miles deep into the mantle. Their spines hardened into ridges of solid granite, and their blood cooled into veins of heavy ore. They dropped flat against the dirt, and the dust blew over them, burying their faces beneath layers of topsoil. They became the foundational matter of the terrain. The shifting of wind, the cooling of ice, and the turning of the tides emanated from the final, rhythmic pulses of their buried bodies. In the center of this newly solidified landscape, Oriel stood atop a plateau of barren rock. His golden armor hung heavy with soot, and he moved with a slow, grinding stiffness. He turned his head and locked his eyes on Lorcan, who stood completely unaffected by the draining gravity, covered in the same black ash he had carried from the void. Oriel reached down to his side and drew a long, curved weapon, forged from hardened sunlight. He gripped the handle tightly, leveled the glowing edge directly at Lorcan's chest, and stepped forward across the fractured stones. Oriel swung his weapon of hardened sunlight downward, striking the solid obsidian ground at Lorcan's feet. Lorcan raised his heavy arms, summoning thick clouds of black ash to deflect the incoming heat. Behind Oriel, thousands of spirits with gold-plated skin and sharp angular features marched forward in tight, grid-like formations. They wielded spears of solid crystal and held up broad shields woven from concentrated light. On the opposing side, Lorcan stood at the front of a vast force of spirits coated in wet clay, heavy soil, and crushed rock. These dirt-covered figures charged the gold-plated army, swinging blunt clubs of granite and tearing at the crystal shields with bare, mud-stained hands. The two armies collided on the barren crust of the physical world. Sharp fragments of shattered crystal and chunks of wet mud flew through the air as the forces tore into one another, leaving deep craters in the newly formed earth. The gold-plated warriors drove their crystal spears forward, piercing the thick mud armor of their opponents. In the center of the battlefield, a massive spirit named Trinimac pushed through the thick ash clouds. Trinimac gripped a broad, flat blade of polished bronze with both hands. He sprinted directly toward Lorcan, driving his heavy shoulder straight into Lorcan's chest. The physical impact threw Lorcan backward onto a ridge of jagged rocks. Trinimac dropped his bronze weapon, stepped over the fallen figure, and pinned Lorcan's arms to the ground, using his heavy, armored knees. Oriel approached the pinned figure with heavy, deliberate steps. He raised his glowing sword high and plunged the edge directly through the center of Lorcan's torso. Oriel pulled the blade downward with extreme force, splitting the thick chest cavity open. He reached his bare hands into the opening, gripping the internal organ. The heart throbbed violently against his palms, leaking a thick, dark red fluid that sizzled and burned as it touched the rock below. Oriel ripped the heart entirely free from the surrounding tissue, lifting the pulsing mass high into the air for the surrounding armies to witness. Holding the leaking heart, Oriel commanded the surviving gold-plated spirits to construct a secure perimeter. They moved away from the battlefield to a small, rocky island surrounded by churning ocean waters. The spirits dragged massive blocks of smooth grey metal out of the ground and stacked them in a wide, circular pattern. They built a towering cylindrical spire extending miles into the air, capping the massive pillar with a flat, open observation deck. The spirits hauled thick slabs of iron to form heavy doors at the base. They carried Lorcan's surviving mud-covered followers to the island and pushed them down into the dirt outside the walls. The gold-plated spirits then walked through the heavy doors and assembled in a wide ring on the upper deck of the structure. Oriel placed Lorcan's throbbing heart onto a stone pedestal situated in the exact center of the room. The spirits inside the tower vocalized loud, repeating tones, pointing the sharp tips of their crystal spears directly at the heart on the pedestal. Oriel stepped forward and lifted the heavy red mass once more. He produced a long arrow crafted from solid white light and wrapped thick cords of metal around the wet heart, binding it tightly to the arrowhead. He raised a massive bow of curved gold and fitted the loaded arrow to the string. He released the string with a sharp, cracking sound. The arrow tore through the heavy atmosphere, carrying the bleeding heart across the sky in a bright red streak. The observers tracked its trajectory over the continent, watching the dark fluid rain down onto the forests and plains below as it flew. The arrow slammed into the eastern edge of the landmass. The high-speed impact cracked the continental plate, sending deep shockwaves rolling through the crust. Magma immediately erupted from the deep fissure, shooting towering columns of liquid fire thousands of feet into the air. Boiling rock and thick grey ash piled around the impact site, cooling rapidly and building upon itself layer by layer. A massive, towering volcano formed around the buried heart, casting a long, physical shadow across the eastern landscape. Heavy ash blanketed the surrounding soil, turning the entire region dark and arid. Back at the metal tower, the gathered spirits struck the floor with the butts of their spears in unison. A deep, echoing vibration rippled out from the tower, expanding rapidly across the entire globe in a visible wave of blue energy. As the wave passed over the terrain, the swirling storm clouds dissipated into the high atmosphere. The sun locked into a singular, curving track across the sky. The bright sphere dropped steadily behind the western horizon, covering the land in complete darkness, and then rose precisely in the east, casting the first uniform morning light over the new, cooling terrain. The spirits who survived the conflict descended the metal stairs of the tower and stepped onto the hardened dirt, spreading out across the newly solidified continents to inhabit the distinct environments taking shape around them, carrying their heavy stone tools and forging paths through the dense, expanding forests. The beings who descended from the metal tower placed their feet onto the cooling crust of the physical world. The intense gravity of the new planet pulled against their frames, compressing their remaining light into solid, opaque matter. The glowing vapor of their limbs condensed into dense muscle tissue, pumping dark red blood through networks of thick veins. Their crystalline outer shells softened and peeled away in flakes, exposing bare skin to the moving air and the falling rain. These newly physical beings vocalized the sound El Nofe to identify themselves, walking heavily across the volcanic ash and the sharp rocks. A large population of these El Nofe gathered in a single, secure region to establish their permanent settlements. They stacked large blocks of smooth limestone to construct high, continuous walls around their camps. Inside these enclosures, they arranged thin shards of quartz into precise grids, using the sharp edges to carve specific sequences of lines into flat granite tablets. They organized their daily movements, standing in straight lines to distribute harvested plants and fresh water equally among their population. They constructed tall, overlapping terraces of polished marble, building their homes upward to keep their bodies elevated above the raw dirt. The maps they carved into the stone tablets depicted a massive, unified continent completely covered by these geometric, orderly cities. They vocalized the sound Oldmeris when pointing to these maps, etching the exact layouts of their walled compounds deeply into the rock so the patterns would endure multiple generations. Other groups of El Nofe marched away from the high walls and pushed outward into the unmapped territories. They climbed steep mountain ranges and waded through deep, freezing rivers. The harsh environments triggered rapid biological adaptations in their bodies. As they walked across glaciers, thick layers of coarse hair pushed through their skin to trap body heat. As they crossed arid deserts, their skin thickened into rough, leathery hides that retained internal moisture. The wandering El Nofi dragged fallen tree trunks together and packed wet mud over the timber to create low, rounded shelters. They struck pieces of flint together to create sparks, igniting piles of dry brush to generate localized heat. They tracked grazing animals across the plains, thrusting sharpened lengths of bone into the muscles of their prey and pulling the raw meat apart with their bare teeth. Eventually, the migration paths of the wandering El Nofe brought them back into contact with the high walls of the old El Nofe. The wanderers approached the smooth limestone barriers and struck the stone with heavy wooden clubs and massive boulders. The old El Nofe stood atop their marble terraces and threw spears of concentrated light down into the crowds of wanderers. The resulting physical conflict involved thousands of bodies crashing into one another, tearing flesh and shattering bone. The explosions of magical light scorched wide craters into the soil, and the wanderers uprooted entire trees to use as battering rams against the fortified gates. The repeated detonations and the massive physical impacts sent deep vibrations down into the crust of the planet. The continuous shock waves cracked the tectonic plates beneath their feet. Massive fissures opened across the surface of the unified landmass. Entire sections of the continent dropped thousands of feet into the mantle, pulling the marble terraces and the mud shelters down into the boiling magma. The oceans rushed into these widening gaps, flooding the deep ravines with billions of gallons of heavy salt water. The rushing water permanently separated the landmass into isolated continents, trapping the surviving populations on opposite sides of the newly formed seas. The surviving old El Nofi watched their orderly structures collapse under the crushing waves, forcing them to gather their remaining carved slates and flee to higher elevations. On the largest central landmass, which later maps labeled Tamriel, other biological variations of the original spirits already occupied the dense environments. In the southern jungles, bipeds covered in thick golden fur swung from the heavy vines and dropped onto the damp soil. In the eastern swamps, creatures encased in green, overlapping scales waded through the murky water, tracking fish with vertically slitted eyes. These beastfolk communicated exclusively through guttural vocalizations, sharp hisses, and scent markers scraped deeply into the bark of massive trees. They painted their faces with crushed red berries and grey ash, marking their territories with the skulls of large predators stacked on wooden spikes. They bound sharp pieces of obsidian to the ends of long wooden shafts, using strips of dried animal sinew. They constructed tight clusters of huts, suspended high in the thick canopy. staying elevated above the predatory insects swarming the wet ground below. The scaled and furred bipeds dragged their harvested meat into the dense foliage and gathered around low, smoky fires. They consumed the flesh and tossed the broken bones into the thick mud. As they crouched near the warm embers, they turned their heads toward the southern coastline. The steady rhythm of wooden oars striking the ocean surface echoed across the water. Out on the dark waves, thousands of descendants of the old El Nofi loaded flat stone tablets and sharp crystal weapons onto large, multi-tiered sailing vessels. They pushed these heavy ships away from their sinking islands, navigating the strong ocean currents and steering their wooden bows directly toward the pristine, heavily forested shores of the central continent. The heavy wooden ships scraped against the white sand beaches of a large, pristine island chain located southwest of the central landmass. The figures disembarking possessed tall, slender frames, pale gold skin, and sharply pointed ears. They hauled stone tablets over the wooden rails and dropped them onto the dry sand. At the front, a gold-skinned commander named Torinan stood on the prow of the largest vessel. He gripped a long staff of polished crystal, leaped into the churning salt water, and drove the base of his staff directly into the ocean floor. He vocalized loud, echoing commands to the sailors. The crews dragged 9 ships onto the beach, aligning the wooden prows side by side in the sand to permanently mark the landing site. Later, human scholars inhabiting the northern snowfields documented this specific period by carving deep, vertical notches into standing granite pillars. These scholars etched 2,500 individual grooves into the stone, counting backward from the dates of their own established settlements. They used this physical tally to mark the exact solar cycle when Torinan's 9 ships first struck the white sand. They rubbed crushed charcoal into the carvings to make the long sequence of descending lines visible from a distance, measuring the vast span of time between the arrival of the pale gold figures and the construction of their own wooden halls. On the beach, Torinan directed the unloading of smooth limestone blocks, heavy iron hammers, and woven measuring lines. The tall, gold-skinned builders stacked the limestone, erecting high walls and tall, gleaming spires along the coastline. They constructed a dense, orderly settlement behind the walls and carved the word "First Hold" into the heavy stone gates. Over many solar cycles, these builders reproduced, and their population expanded across the entire island chain. They cleared away the dense island foliage by dragging controlled lines of fire through the heavy brush. They planted uniform rows of agricultural crops in the cleared dirt, and laid broad, flat paving stones to connect their expanding coastal settlements. They vocalized the sound Aldma to identify their specific biological group, distinguishing themselves from the other beings scattering across the globe. As the islands filled with limestone structures and paved roads, the Aldma felled tall trees and constructed new fleets of ships with massive canvas sails. They navigated the narrow ocean channels, caught the prevailing wind currents, and dropped their heavy iron anchors along the sandy coasts of the massive central continent. The Aldma stepped onto the mainland, carrying weapons of forged bronze, overlapping scales of polished armor, and staffs emitting bright, crackling heat. The scaled and furred bipeds occupying the mainland emerged from the dense tree lines to inspect the arriving vessels. These beastfolk hurled sharpened bone spears, heavy rocks, and thick branches at the gold-skinned figures stepping onto the beaches. In response, the Aldma formed tight, organized shield walls. They interlocked their polished metal barriers, stepped forward in unison, and thrust their bronze blades into the exposed flesh of the attackers. The Aldmer in the rear ranks raised their crystal staffs and released concentrated streams of liquid fire over the shield wall. The fire ignited the wooden projectiles, the thick fur, and the dried grass surrounding the beast folk. The hostile bipeds dropped their crude weapons and fled away from the blazing coastlines. The furred creatures retreated deep into the thick, humid canopy of the southern jungles, pulling the heavy hanging vines upward to block the lower pathways. The scaled bipeds waded into the black, stagnant waters of the eastern swamps, submerging their bodies entirely beneath the thick mud and breathing through hollow reeds protruding above the surface. The remaining scattered hostile inhabitants climbed the jagged, freezing peaks of the northern mountain ranges, squeezing their bodies into dark, low-ceilinged caves and rolling heavy boulders over the entrances. Having thoroughly secured the white sand coastlines, the Aldmer quarried white stone from the nearby cliffs and erected tall, slender towers overlooking the oceans. They cleared the surrounding wild brush, replacing the indigenous flora with measured grids of their own crops. Inside these central towers, the Aldmer used sharp metal instruments to scratch precise repeating symbols into flat sheets of dried animal skin and baked clay. They physically recorded the exact dimensions of their newly erected buildings, the biological traits of the local fauna, and the specific coordinates of the stars above them. As the Aldmer expanded their outposts further into the interior of the continent, the vast stretches of land separated their populations. The thick, deep forests, vast mountain ranges, and rushing rivers blocked the paved roads and disrupted their lines of communication. The Aldmer, inhabiting the dense southern jungles, began wearing different materials, wrapping their bodies in spun spider silk and boiled leather. The Aldmer, settling the flat central plains, utilized entirely different types of mortar and stone for their towers. The localized diets, varying climates, and complete physical isolation forced their bodies to undergo separate biological adaptations. Their uniform gold skin, tall physical frames, and identical tools slowly started to fracture into highly distinct, specialized variations as they entrenched themselves in their isolated environments. The gold-skinned builders on the island chain continued stacking limestone and quartz blocks. They erected a massive central spire entirely from translucent, crystalline rock. Sunlight passed through the faceted walls, projecting sharp spectrums of light across the paved courtyards below. The builders inhabiting these islands maintained the tall, upright posture and pale gold skin of their ancestors. They measured their bloodlines meticulously, carving extensive family records into the smooth crystal walls. Observers recorded their specific biological structure using the term Altmer. A specific family of these Altmer, bearing the clan mark Direni, loaded their supply crates onto long wooden ships and sailed toward the western coast of the central continent. They navigated into a large circular bay and dropped anchor near the rocky island, holding the original cylindrical metal tower from the Dawn era. The Direni walked across the dirt, running their bare hands over the smooth, seamless grey metal of the structure. They hauled heavy iron crates into the lower chambers and established their living quarters inside the ancient walls, positioning sentries on the upper observation deck to monitor the surrounding coastlines. Meanwhile, an explorer named Topal stood at the wooden helm of a large sailing vessel. He unrolled flat sheets of cured animal skin across a wooden table and scratched dark ink lines onto the surface using a sharpened quill. He sailed along the entire perimeter of the massive continent, recording the exact indentations of the coastlines, the locations of the river mouths, and the density of the coastal forests. During his navigation of a wide, muddy river leading into the central landmass, Topal documented dense, humid jungles completely covering the interior. Deep within those central jungles, a faction of elves cleared away the massive ferns and thick, hanging vines. They constructed tall, white marble columns and wide, circular plazas. In the center of their settlements, they erected a towering structure composed of pale stone and gold plating, mirroring the design of the metal tower in the west. These elves wore cloaks constructed of brightly colored bird feathers and utilized glowing blue stones to illuminate their structures at night. They arranged these stones in precise geometric patterns to emit localized heat and light. They spoke in loud, sharp syllables, preserving the exact auditory frequencies used by the original spirits. The surrounding populations recorded the name Aelids for this group. Further south, underneath the thickest parts of the canopy, another faction built their sleeping platforms directly upon the massive roots and branches of the towering trees. Their physical frames compressed, growing much shorter and leaner to navigate the dense foliage. Their skin took on the brown and green hues of the surrounding bark, and small, bony protrusions pushed through the skin on their foreheads. They hunted the local fauna, tearing the raw meat from the bones and consuming the marrow, ingesting animal flesh exclusively. They identified themselves with the vocalization Bosma. Far to the south of the main continent, thick, warm fog covered a remote chain of islands. The elves who settled this isolated archipelago underwent a severe biological shift. Their golden skin turned completely translucent, revealing the blue veins pulsing underneath. Their eyes widened, presenting as solid white orbs. They stood on the wet rocks and manipulated long, thick ropes to capture the massive, scaled sea serpents swimming through the channels. They rode upon the backs of these reptiles, steering them through the heavy fog. These serpent riders carried the designation Maorma. To the extreme north, the freezing temperatures triggered a different biological adaptation. The temperatures dropped heavily, coating the rocky valleys in deep, permanent layers of snow and thick ice. The elves marching into these blizzards wrapped themselves in heavy animal furs. Over multiple generations, their skin lost all pigmentation, turning as white as the surrounding snowfields. They cut massive blocks of solid ice and stacked them to form high-vaulted structures, reflecting the bright green and purple auroras burning in the night sky above. They hauled heavy ivory spears to hunt the massive, thick-haired beasts wandering the tundra. Observers documented them as the Falmer. Between the freezing northern valleys and the eastern ash-covered plains, a jagged mountain range divided the terrain. A faction of elves approached these stone peaks, holding heavy iron pickaxes, bronze hammers, and complex measuring calipers. They struck the mountainsides, excavating deep, wide tunnels directly into the solid bedrock. They descended miles below the surface, extracting raw ores of iron, copper, and gold. They smelted these metals in massive, roaring furnaces, pouring the liquid alloys into precisely carved clay molds. The resulting gears, pistons, and pipes formed the infrastructure of vast mechanical underground cities. Plumes of hot, grey steam vented out of the rock faces, hissing loudly as the pressurized vapor met the cold mountain air. These elves grew thick, coarse hair on their lower faces and bound it with metal clasps. They carried the name Dwemer, constructing machines that generated localized, artificial gravity and heat. While the Dwemer bolted thick bronze plates onto their subterranean walls, a separate group of elves gathered on the surface of the eastern plains. They wore long, heavy robes woven from insect silk and carried long staffs of carved bone. They stood in the harsh winds, listening to the loud, guttural vocalizations of a tall figure named Veloth. Veloth pointed his staff eastward, directly toward the massive, ash-spewing volcano that dominated the horizon. He lowered his arm and began walking across the dry, cracked dirt, leading the large crowd of followers directly into the falling grey ash. Veloth walked at the front of the procession, gripping his long staff carved from a single piece of white bone. He struck the hard dirt with the heavy end, setting a steady pace for the thousands of elves marching behind him. These followers wore heavy robes woven from the silk of giant insects, pulling the dense fabric over their heads to block the falling grey ash. They turned their backs on the white limestone towers and crystal spires of their ancestors. They looked toward fissures in the ground, where pools of dark water and green fire bubbled. From these rifts, 3 distinct entities from oblivion projected physical shadows across the rocks, communicating instructions through overlapping, guttural voices. The elves adjusted their paths, following the exact vocal commands echoing from the shifting dark vapors. Trinomac stepped directly into the path of the marching elves, his heavy armored boots cracking the dried earth. He gripped his broad, flat blade of polished bronze and drove the tip of the weapon into the dirt. He raised his free hand, pointing back toward the crystal spires of the island chain. He emitted loud, percussive vocalizations, commanding the silk-robed elves to drop their bone staffs and reverse their trajectory. The marching column halted in the dirt. The elves lowered their heads, clutching their heavy robes tightly against the freezing air, moving rapidly down from the surrounding mountain peaks. Trinomac's own vanguard of gold-skinned warriors drew their crystal weapons and formed a solid line across the rocky valley. A massive cloud of black vapor and jagged iron spikes materialized directly above Trinomac. This entity, identifying itself through shifting auditory frequencies as the Daedra Boethia, dropped heavily onto the bronze-armored spirit. The black vapor expanded, opening a wide, tearing cavity lined with rows of rotating teeth. Boethia completely engulfed Trinomac, swallowing the massive figure and his bronze armor whole. The elves and Trinomac's vanguard watched the heavy vapor churn and bulge from the inside as Trinomac pressed his hands against the dark mass. The thrashing movements within the vapor stopped. Boethia opened the central cavity and produced exact replicas of Trinomac's percussive vocalizations, manipulating the auditory waves to instruct the marching elves to continue their journey eastward. Following the digestion, Boethia expelled the physical remains of Trinomac onto the ash-covered ground. The expelled matter consisted of corrosive, foul-smelling sludge and twisted, oxidized metal. Trinomac's vanguard of warriors rushed forward and plunged their bare hands into the steaming pile. As the sludge coated their pale gold skin, their biological structures mutated rapidly. Their skin turned a dark olive green, their heavy brow ridges thickened and lowered over their eyes. Their lower jawbones expanded outward, forcing 2 thick, sharp tusks to protrude upward past their upper lips. Their muscle mass doubled, tearing the fine seams of their silk clothing. These mutated warriors picked up heavy iron clubs and scattered into the surrounding mountain caves, vocalizing the sound Orsima as they fled the falling ash. Veloth raised his bone staff and led his followers past the steaming crater, marching eastward into the heavy volcanic ash. They arrived in the wide, jagged valleys surrounding the massive, active volcano and vocalized the name Resdain for the region. They constructed angular, sloping shelters out of hardened mud and the hollowed-out shells of massive beetles. They collected the skulls and femur bones of their deceased elders, placing them carefully into alcoves carved directly into the walls of their homes. They burned fragrant resins and dried fungi over open flames, inhaling the thick smoke while pressing their faces against the dirt floors in front of the bone shrines. They designated themselves the Kaima, layering their bodies in armor constructed from overlapping sections of insect chitin. As the Kaima gathered food from the ash-covered plains, they observed thick plumes of gray steam rising from the nearby mountain peaks. They climbed the rocky slopes and discovered the heavy bronze doors, rotating gears, and exhaust pipes bolted into the rock faces by the Dwemer. The Kaima smelled the burning oil and smelted copper. They gripped their bone spears and sharpened obsidian daggers tightly, striking the bronze doors with heavy rocks to breach the subterranean metal cities. The Dwemer mechanics deployed rotating metallic spheres and walking automatons constructed of brass to repel the attackers. The two factions initiated a continuous physical cycle of ambushes and defensive barricades across the mountain passes. Far to the north of these ash-covered valleys, the air temperatures dropped rapidly across a separate landmass named Atmora. Glaciers expanded across the plains, burying the vegetation under miles of solid ice. Tall, heavily muscled humans wrapped in thick bear furs gathered on the freezing coastlines. They chopped down the remaining pine trees and lashed the heavy timber together, constructing long, deep-hulled wooden ships. A large human named Isgramor stepped onto the prow of the leading vessel and gripped a thick steering oar. He pointed the wooden bow southward, guiding the massive fleet of humans away from the advancing glaciers and directly toward the snowy northern coastlines of the central continent. The heavy wooden hulls of the Atmoran longships smashed through the thick ice floes of the northern ocean. Large humans wrapped in layered bear hides pulled thick hemp ropes, angling the massive canvas sails to catch the freezing winds. At the front of the largest vessel, a tall, heavily muscled man named Isgramor stood with his boots planted firmly on the wooden deck. He gripped a heavy iron battle-axe and stared at the approaching shoreline. The ships ground against the frozen pebbles of a northern peninsula the humans named Hassaric Head. The men threw thick iron anchors into the shallow water and waded through the freezing surf, carrying iron tools, heavy sacks of grain, and carved wooden totems of animal deities. The Atmorans marched inland across the snowfields. They chopped down towering pine trees with their iron axes and dragged the heavy timber into a wide valley. They hauled massive blocks of grey granite from the nearby quarries, stacking the stones to form thick outer walls and high vaulted halls. They lit roaring fires in the center of the settlement, burning the pine logs to generate heat against the continuous blizzards. They carved the shape of a wolf into the central wooden pillars and etched the name Sarthal onto the heavy iron gates. The humans dug deep cellars beneath the frozen earth, storing their grain and salted meats below the frost line. As the humans expanded their settlement, the pale-skinned elves of the region approached the stone walls. These Falmer walked across the deep snow, wearing cloaks of white wolf fur and carrying spears, tipped with polished ivory. The humans opened the iron gates and placed wooden crates of forged iron tools and woven wool onto the ground. The elves placed bundles of luminescent fungi and carved bone charms beside the crates. The two groups picked up each other's goods and returned to their respective settlements. This exchange of physical materials continued over several solar cycles. During the excavation of deeper storage cellars beneath Sarthal, the human miners struck a hollow cavern. In the center of this underground chamber, a massive sphere hovered directly above the rock floor. The sphere emitted a continuous, pulsating blue and green light. Thick metallic rings covered in glowing geometric scripts rotated slowly around the central orb. The light from the sphere projected sharp, shifting shadows across the cavern walls and generated a low, vibrating hum that echoed through the tunnels. The humans dropped their pickaxes, leaving the rotating sphere in the center of the chamber, and climbed the wooden ladders back to the surface. The Falmer observed the blue light glowing from the deep excavation shafts. They gathered by the thousands in the surrounding snowfields. During the darkest part of the lunar cycle, the pale elves marched toward the stone walls of Sarthol. They carried torches of burning pitch and held long, curved blades of hardened ice. They threw the burning torches onto the thatched wooden roofs of the human dwellings. The dry timber ignited rapidly, spreading a thick black smoke through the settlement. The humans ran from their burning homes, holding wooden shields and iron swords. The Falmer drove their ice blades through the heavy furs and flesh of the humans, leaving the bodies bleeding onto the white snow. The elves broke through the iron gates and descended into the deep cellars, moving directly toward the pulsating blue and green sphere. Ysgramor stood in the center of the burning city, swinging his heavy iron battle-axe through the surrounding elves. He grabbed the arms of his two sons, Ingol and Ilgar, and pulled them away from the collapsing stone walls. The three humans ran through the falling snow, leaving the burning settlement behind them. They reached the northern coastline, pushed a small wooden skiff into the freezing water, and gripped the wooden oars. They pulled the oars continuously, dragging the small boat across the ocean swells, heading back toward the freezing continent of Atmora. The snow fell heavily over the ruined stones for many solar cycles. The Falmer patrolled the ruins of Sarthal, holding their ivory spears and watching the ocean. Hundreds of massive wooden longships emerged from the grey fog. The prows of the ships carried carved wooden faces of screaming bears and wolves. The hulls scraped against the frozen pebbles, and 500 heavily muscled humans leaped into the surf. They painted their faces and chests with thick blue woad. They carried massive steel battle-axes, heavy iron shields, and long iron broadswords. Ysgramor led the charge, raising a massive black steel axe above his head and driving the blade directly into the chest of the nearest Falmer sentry. The 500 humans formed a solid wall of iron shields and marched across the snowfields. They swung their heavy steel axes, breaking the ice blades and ivory spears of the elves. They pushed the Falmer away from the coastal plains, driving them deep into the southern mountain ranges. Behind the marching shield walls, another human figure walked alone across the blood-stained snow. This warrior wore a complete suit of heavy iron plate armor, covered entirely in the dried blood of his enemies. A large, red, diamond-shaped crystal glowed brightly in the center of his chest plate. He gripped a heavy iron mace in his right hand, dragging the spiked head across the frozen rocks. The humans pointed to this armored figure and vocalized the names Pelinal and Ysmir. He walked silently past the marching armies, leaving deep, heavy footprints in the snow as he wandered southward across the continent. As the humans built new stone halls over the captured valleys, massive shadows drifted over the snowfields. The humans looked up and tracked enormous winged reptiles descending from the heavy clouds. These creatures possessed thick, overlapping scales of black and bronze, long spiked tails, and wide maws lined with serrated teeth. The winged reptiles clamped their heavy talons onto the jagged peaks of the mountains and opened their jaws, exhaling long, continuous streams of liquid fire over the frozen slopes. Tall humans wearing robes of woven dragon scales and heavy iron masks, shaped like reptilian faces, walked out of the stone halls, dropping to their knees in the snow, directly beneath the perching beasts. The Atmorans who settled the northern snowfields hauled heavy blocks of grey granite up the steep mountain slopes. They stacked these stones to build massive, open-air temples at the very peaks of the jagged rock formations. These humans followed the physical directions of a specific caste of men from their own population. These leaders wore long robes, woven from shed reptile scales, and covered their faces with heavy iron masks, shaped like the horned heads of dragons. The masked priests pointed their iron staffs toward the lower valleys, commanding the rest of the human population to extract raw ore from the caves and harvest wheat from the cleared forests. The workers loaded the grain, freshly slaughtered livestock, and mined gold into wooden carts and dragged them up the icy stone steps to the temple altars. Massive winged reptiles descended from the heavy clouds and landed heavily on the stone walls of the temples, their sharp talons gouging deep grooves into the granite. These dragons possessed thick, overlapping scales, wide wingspans of leathery membrane, and long rows of serrated teeth. They snapped their massive jaws over the slaughtered sheep and swallowed the meat and bone whole. The largest of these winged reptiles possessed jet-black scales and thick rows of jagged spikes running down his spine. The humans and the other dragons vocalized the name Alduin when directing their gaze toward him. Alduin perched on the highest central mountain peak, looking down at the stone temples and the expanding human settlements below. When he opened his jaws, he exhaled concentrated streams of liquid fire that instantly melted the snow into pools of boiling water. The human population dropped to their knees, pressing their bare foreheads into the freezing mud whenever his enormous shadow passed over their villages. The masked priests struck the backs of kneeling workers with thick wooden rods, forcing them to haul heavier loads of stone up the mountain paths to expand the massive temples built exclusively for the Black Dragon. The human workers eventually turned their iron tools against the masked priests. A worker swung a heavy iron pickaxe, driving the sharp point directly through the chest plate of a priest. Other humans gripped their forged steel broadswords and marched up the mountain steps. They struck the priests, breaking the iron masks and leaving the bodies bleeding on the stone altars. The dragons responded by taking to the sky and inhaling deep breaths of the freezing air. They unleashed torrents of fire across the wooden halls and stone settlements, turning the wooden roofs into blazing infernos and charring the human bodies to grey ash. The human weapons of iron and steel bounced off the thick, overlapping scales of the dragons, leaving shallow scratches on their armored hides. The humans died by the thousands, their bodies accumulating in the burning valleys. A different dragon, possessing faded green scales and a torn right wing membrane, landed on a secluded mountain ridge away from the burning settlements. He sat on the frozen rocks alongside a small group of human warriors. The green dragon opened his maw, vibrating his throat muscles, and expelled a loud, percussive vocalization. The sheer physical force of the sound wave shattered a nearby granite boulder into thousands of tiny fragments. The humans observed the exact movements of his throat and the specific shape of his open jaw. They inhaled massive volumes of air, expanding their own chests, and pushed the air out over their vocal cords in the exact same pattern. They produced loud, concussive sounds that generated physical kinetic waves. These humans focused their newly learned vocalizations, called the thuum, to project walls of solid force and streams of localized frost against the other dragons. They aimed their voices at the sky, knocking the winged reptiles out of the air and bringing them crashing down into the dirt, where the human warriors drove steel axes into their exposed necks. 3 of these human vocalizers climbed to the absolute summit of the highest mountain. They stood ankle-deep in the snow as Alduin descended from the heavy clouds and crashed onto the frozen rocks. The 3 humans inhaled simultaneously and expelled a synchronized concussive vocalization directly at the black dragon. The sound waves struck Alduin in the chest, forcing his massive body down into the snow and pinning his wings against the dirt. One of the humans reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a thick, metallic cylinder containing a rolled sheet of dense parchment. He unfurled the parchment, revealing complex, glowing geometric scripts that vibrated with intense magical energy. A blinding flash of blue and gold light erupted from the open scroll, wrapping tightly around Alduin's thrashing body. The light compressed inward, pulling the black dragon entirely out of the physical space. Alduin vanished from the mountain peak, leaving a deep, scorched crater in the melting snow. With the sky clear of the massive reptiles, the surviving humans descended the mountain and returned to the smoking ruins of their settlements. They picked up their iron axes and began chopping fresh pine timber to rebuild their shattered halls. They established new bloodlines of rulers to govern the expanding northern territories, while far to the south, other families of elves and men gathered building materials to lay the foundation stones for entirely new dynasties across the dense jungles. Are the ones who do. In the dense, humid jungles of the southern continent, the small, brown-skinned elves moved continuously through the thick canopy. A specific elf named Eplia stepped onto a massive, moss-covered tree root and raised a carved bone horn to his lips. He blew a long, vibrating note that carried through the heavy foliage, and thousands of his kin climbed the hanging vines to gather on the suspended wooden platforms around him. Eplia directed these workers to interlock the thick branches of a towering grat oak, using specific, sustained vocal frequencies to stimulate the tree's biological growth. The heavy wood twisted and hollowed out, forming wide internal chambers and natural wooden bridges. Eplia organized a central collection point within this massive tree, instructing the surrounding settlements to deliver surplus animal pelts, woven spider silk, and fresh meat. His immediate family members occupied the highest chambers, directly overseeing the distribution of these goods. To mark the consolidation of this resource network, Eplia handed a sharp obsidian blade to a scribe. The scribe approached the central trunk and carved one deep, vertical notch into the bark. Thick sap seeped from the cut, permanently marking the first solar cycle of a new sequential tally. Later scholars, examining this exact carving, designated it the physical starting point of the First Era. Far to the north, heavy blizzards battered the frozen coastlines. The heavily muscled humans of the Isgramor bloodline dragged massive slabs of dark granite across the ice. They positioned these stones over a fast-moving, freezing river, locking the blocks together with iron pins to form a wide, solid bridge. On the far riverbank, the workers erected towering walls of grey stone and constructed a massive central hall. Inside this hall, they chiseled a wide seat from a single boulder and draped it with the thick pelts of snow bears. The human leaders sat upon this stone throne and directed their warriors southward. The human armies formed tight columns, marching through the pine forests, holding heavy steel broadswords and circular iron shields. They tracked the pale-skinned Falmer across the snowfields, and when the two groups collided, the humans swung their steel weapons, easily shattering the fragile ivory spears of the elves. The humans drove the Falmer away from the flat valleys, setting fire to their animal hide tents and leaving the elven bodies bleeding into the white snow. As the humans advanced, They erected tall wooden totems carved with the shapes of hawks, bears, and snakes over the conquered soil, physically marking their expanding territorial borders. The surviving Falmer retreated steadily into the high, jagged mountain passes. They trudged through waist-deep snowdrifts, carrying their wounded over their shoulders. Freezing winds stripped the heat from their bodies, and they chewed on exposed tree bark and frozen moss to sustain their biological functions. Eventually, the ragged column of elves reached a sheer rock wall. Plumes of hot grey steam hissed from brass pipes embedded directly into the granite. Between these pipes stood massive doors constructed of solid bronze. The Falmer approached the heated metal and struck the bronze with the blunt ends of their broken spears. Deep within the rock, heavy metal gears rotated and thick pistons engaged. The bronze doors swung inward, revealing the illuminated, stone-carved tunnels of the subterranean Dwemer cities. The Dwemer mechanics stood just inside the threshold, wearing overlapping plates of bronze armor and observing the freezing Falmer with measuring calipers and glowing crystals. The mechanics stepped aside, allowing the pale elves to walk into the heated corridors, safe from the lethal blizzards. Once the Falmer crossed the threshold, the Dwemer pulled heavy iron levers, and the bronze doors slammed shut, locking tightly to seal the tunnel. The mechanics guided the pale elves down long, spiraling staircases into a massive cavern located miles below the surface crust. The floor of this cavern sprouted enormous, luminescent fungi that cast a pale blue glow over the rocks. The Dwemer harvested these specific toxic mushrooms and handed the raw fungus to the starving Falmer. The Falmer ingested the glowing plants, and the chemical compounds within the fungi immediately reacted with the elven biological structures. Their white eyes clouded over, developing thick, opaque cataracts that permanently blocked all visual input. The Falmer dropped to their hands and knees, sliding their fingers across the cold stone to navigate the absolute darkness. The Dwemer mechanics approached the blinded elves and fastened heavy iron collars around their necks. They attached thick, interconnected metal chains to the collars, linking the Falmer together in long lines. The engineers placed heavy iron pickaxes into the hands of the blind workers and directed them toward the solid bedrock walls. The Falmer swung the tools, chipping away the stone to extract raw ores. Over successive generations of continuous labor and biological reliance on the toxic fungi, the physical posture of the Falmer bent permanently forward, their frames withering into hunched figures, adapted exclusively to the subterranean blackness. While the northern Dwemer secured their chained workers to the tunnel walls, another faction of their mechanics residing under the eastern volcano opened their own bronze gates. These eastern Dwemer stepped out onto the ash-covered slopes, lowered their heavy brass spheres, and extended their bare, unarmored hands toward the silk-robed Chimer standing outside, initiating a sudden halt to their ongoing physical strikes. The Chimer and the Dwemer aligned their physical borders across the ash-covered plains of Resdain. Indoril Nerevar, a tall Chimer warrior, wearing armor constructed from hardened insect shells, stood beside Dumak, a Dwemer king, clad in overlapping bronze plates. The two leaders drove their respective weapons directly into the volcanic soil side by side, signaling the coordination of their military forces. Consequently, Chima scouts wielding bone bows marched alongside Dwemer mechanical spheres to patrol the perimeter of the eastern continent. The two distinct populations shared the harvest of the fungal forests and transported quarried stone along the same paved pathways. Furthermore, they constructed joint settlements where mud brick huts sat directly adjacent to heavy brass exhaust pipes. Deep beneath the central volcano, a Dwemer tonal architect named Kagranak excavated a massive cavern. He swung a heavy iron pickaxe into the solid bedrock, dislodging a thick layer of basalt. The broken stone fell away, exposing a massive, fleshy organ embedded directly in the crust of the earth. This was the heart of Lorcan, left behind from the Dawn era. The organ measured 30 feet across, leaking thick, boiling red fluid onto the cavern floor. The entire mass expanded and contracted in a slow, rhythmic pulse, sending deep, low-frequency vibrations through the surrounding rock. Kagranak approached the pulsing tissue and placed metal calipers against the surface, recording the exact circumference and tracking the intervals between the heavy beats. Kagranak returned to his subterranean forge and ignited a roaring fire, fueled by pressurized volcanic gas. He melted bars of dense metal and poured the liquid alloy into 3 specific clay molds. First, he constructed a massive, short-handled hammer with a flat, heavy head, etching tonal grooves into the handle. He named this hammer Sunder. Second, he forged a short, sharply angled blade out of blue crystal, fastening it to a brass hilt. He designated this blade Keening. Finally, he crafted a thick, articulated metal gauntlet lined with insulated mesh to absorb extreme thermal shock, carrying the designation Wraithguard. Additionally, Kagranak directed his mechanics to assemble thousands of massive brass gears and jointed metal limbs inside a towering central chamber. The mechanics bolted these components together, erecting a brass humanoid figure towering hundreds of feet into the air. This massive construct possessed empty optical sensors and a hollow chest cavity shaped precisely to hold the massive red heart. The Dwemer mechanics vocalized the sound Numidium to identify this towering brass construct. Nerevar walked into the subterranean assembly chamber and observed the towering brass legs of the Numidium. He looked at the massive hollow chest cavity and immediately drew his long, curved bone sword. He turned his blade toward Dumak, driving the sharp edge against the Dwemer king's bronze chest plate. The physical clashes erupted instantly across the surface and throughout the tunnels. The Chimer swung obsidian daggers and channeled blasts of extreme thermal energy, while the Dwemer deployed rotating brass automatons that fired heavy metal bolts. Thick blood, mixed with leaking mechanical oil, flowing across the basalt floors. Nerevar pushed through the combat lines, accompanied by his 3 highest-ranking lieutenants, Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek. The 4 Chimer forced their way into the lowest central cavern, stepping over shattered automatons to reach the pulsing red mass of the heart. Inside the deep chamber, Kagranak stood directly in front of the bleeding organ. He slid his left hand into the heavy metal mesh of Wraithguard. He gripped the handle of Sunder in his right hand and swung the heavy mallet forward, striking the center of the heart with maximum physical force. The impact produced a high-pitched, echoing frequency that visibly warped the surrounding air. Subsequently, Kagranak dropped the hammer, drew the crystal blade keening, and sliced a deep vertical sequence across the bruised tissue. The heart emitted a second, much louder frequency that completely overtook the auditory range of the cavern. In the exact moment the sound wave peaked, the physical flesh, bone, and hair of Kagranak dissolved instantly into grey dust. Simultaneously, across the entire continent, the cellular structures of every single living Dwemer disintegrated into loose ash. Their heavy bronze armor collapsed onto the stone floors. Their iron weapons clattered against the rocks. The steam engines and brass spheres continued to rotate and vent pressurized gas, navigating through the piles of empty breastplates and vacant boots. Nerevar sustained deep, severe lacerations across his torso during the confrontation in the chamber. He dropped his bone sword, and his knees struck the basalt floor. He fell flat onto his back, and his lungs emptied of air, remaining completely motionless. Almalexia, Sotha-Sil, and Vivek stepped over the motionless body of their commander. They approached the pedestal, picked up the scattered tools, and slid their hands into the metal gauntlet. They struck the bleeding organ with the hammer and sliced the tissue with the blade, replicating Kagranak's exact sequence. A bright, blinding white light erupted from the heart and washed over the three Kaima. Their biological structures shifted rapidly, their skin transformed, presenting a sharp vertical split of golden yellow and dark grey pigmentation. They lifted their boots off the ground, hovering 2 feet above the cavern floor, and projected radiant halos of glowing energy from their skulls. Far away from the eastern volcano, a different physical struggle occupied the dense, humid jungles of the central continent. Tall, golden-skinned elves, wearing cloaks of bright bird feathers, cracked long, barbed leather whips through the damp air. Below them, heavily muscled humans bearing thick iron collars around their necks dragged massive blocks of white marble through the thick mud. The humans hauled the heavy stones toward the center of the jungle, looking up at a towering cylindrical structure capped with a broad, gleaming golden roof. Inside the central settlement surrounding the white gold tower, the Aelids arranged their human slaves into tight lines. The golden-skinned elves walked down the rows, carrying long iron hooks, striking the bare backs of any human who dropped a marble block. In the central plazas, Aelid priests wearing feathered cloaks tied living humans to sloping stone altars. The priests slid long obsidian knives into the abdomens of the bound humans, extracting the internal organs and setting the tissue on fire to read the color of the smoke. These specific rituals divided the Aelid population. One faction constructed shrines to the original Aedra, placing offerings of grain and clean water on the stones. A secondary, growing faction erected statues depicting the Daedric entities of oblivion, pressing the severed heads of human slaves onto iron spikes surrounding these new shrines. The Aelid factions physically separated, drawing weapons and engaging in violent skirmishes across the paved roads of their own cities, marking the beginning of the Narfincel schism. While the Aelid masters fought each other in the plazas, a human slave named Alessia slipped away from the quarry lines. She ran deep into the thickest part of the jungle, her bare feet sinking into the wet mud. She dropped to her knees at the base of a massive, ancient oak tree and pressed her face against the exposed roots. She vocalized a continuous, high-pitched plea directed upward toward the sky. Her vocalizations carried over the wind, reaching the highest atmospheric layers. Above the canopy, a massive, winged figure descended through the heavy clouds. This entity possessed the heavily muscled torso of a man and the thick, furred head of a massive bull, with large, black-feathered wings extending from his back. He identified himself as Morihaus and landed heavily next to Alessia, leaving deep craters in the mud. He handed Alessia a large, circular red diamond attached to a thick gold chain, instructing her to wear it directly over her chest. Alessia placed the Amulet of Kings around her neck and walked back into the slave camps. She raised the glowing red diamond, and the light reflected off the mud-covered faces of the human workers. The slaves dropped their heavy loads of marble, picked up their iron mining tools, and turned toward their Aelid overseers. They swung their heavy iron hammers, crushing the skulls of the golden-skinned elves and breaking their long iron hooks. Morihaus flew directly over the Aelid settlements, dropping massive boulders onto the white marble roofs and crushing the feathered priests beneath the falling stone. During the heavy fighting outside the white gold tower, the heavily armored human warrior Pelinal approached the Chimera lines. Pelinal gripped his iron mace and swung it horizontally, shattering the crystal shields and breaking the bronze armor of the Ayleid guards. He marched directly into the central throne room of the tower, where an Ayleid king named Umaril stood wearing an intricate suit of overlapping gold plates. Pelinal swung his mace into Umaril's chest, denting the gold armor and breaking the king's ribs. Umaril fell to the marble floor, but as Pelinal raised his weapon for a final strike, dozens of other Ayleid kings swarmed into the chamber. They drove long crystal spears through the gaps in Pelinal's iron plate armor. The spears pierced his internal organs, and he collapsed onto the white stone, bleeding heavily from dozens of deep lacerations. Alessia and Morihaus pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the throne room and discovered Pelinal's severed head resting on the marble floor. Alessia stepped over the remaining Ayleid bodies and approached the central throne. She sat on the carved stone seat and established the first empire of men. She pulled the Amulet of Kings from her chest and held it high above her head. The red diamond emitted a massive vertical beam of bright red light that shot through the roof of the tower and pierced the dark clouds above. As the red light struck the upper atmosphere, a physical barrier of solid energy expanded outward, wrapping around the entire globe. This barrier completely blocked the Daedric entities of Oblivion from physically entering the physical plane, severing their connection as long as the red fires continued to burn in the center of the Imperial City. With the central region secured, Alessia dispatched columns of armored human soldiers to the borders of the jungle. They marched outward, carrying heavy iron broadswords and tall wooden shields painted with the red diamond insignia. They pushed the surviving Ayleids out of the central valleys, forcing them into the dense northern pine forests and the western mountain ranges. The human soldiers erected thick wooden palisades and stone watchtowers along the newly established borders, securing their control over the central continent, while a new, rigid human religious order began to take root within the walls of their capital city. Inside the white gold tower, human priests draped in heavy, grey-spun wool walked across the polished marble floors. They climbed onto the elevated stone pedestals, previously occupied by the golden-skinned elves. The priests projected loud, repeating vocalizations over the gathered crowds of human workers, holding up thick iron amulets, shaped like a single, solid ring. They directed the workers to carry heavy iron mallets into the central plazas. The workers swung the mallets, striking the tall crystal statues of the elven deities. The crystal shattered into jagged fragments, and the workers ground the fragments into fine dust under their heavy leather boots. The priests swept the dust into wooden buckets and dumped it into the surrounding river currents. They commanded the human population to align their behavior to one rigid set of vocalized rules. The workers stacked the animal skin scrolls left by the Ayleids into large piles and held burning torches against the dry leather. The scrolls ignited, sending columns of thick black smoke up through the circular openings in the tower ceilings. Human soldiers formed tight lines across the paved roads, driving the surviving elves out of the city limits using long wooden pikes and heavy iron shields. A specific group of these grey-robed priests formed an isolated faction called the Marukati Selective. They marched in a single, continuous line westward, away from the central jungles, walking until they reached the circular bay surrounding the ancient cylindrical metal tower. The priests climbed the internal metal staircases of the structure and positioned themselves in a tight circle on the flat upper observation deck. They held long staves carved from hardened oak. The priests stepped in rapid, overlapping circles, striking the smooth grey metal of the tower floor with the heavy wooden ends of their staves. They vocalized a series of loud, conflicting auditory frequencies, aiming to physically sever the elven aspects of time from their human deity. As the oak staves struck the metal deck, the physical sky above the tower fractured into jagged, visible fault lines. The sun halted its steady, linear arc across the horizon. The bright sphere dropped directly downward, reappeared in the northern sky, and split into 8 smaller, independently moving spheres of light. The atmospheric conditions across the continent degraded into immediate physical chaos. The surrounding oak trees grew thick, green foliage, dropped their dried leaves, and accumulated heavy layers of freezing snow, all within a single rotation of the planet. Human farmers pushed iron plows through wet mud, and the soil instantly hardened into solid ice, snapping the metal blades in half. The ocean waters receded miles away from the coastlines, exposing the rocky seabed, and immediately crashed back onto the shore in massive, crushing waves. Water flowed upward from the rivers into the heavy clouds. The observers on the ground etched conflicting physical events into their stone tablets. One scribe carved records of a burning drought, while another scribe standing on the exact same stone terrace documented a freezing blizzard occurring simultaneously. This complete breakdown of chronological sequence and environmental stability persisted for over 1,000 solar cycles. When the multiple suns finally fused back into a single sphere and resumed a steady western trajectory, the human armies of the Alessian Empire resumed their outward march. They crossed the western hills carrying heavy steel axes and wide wooden shields, aiming to secure the rocky peninsulas. At the boundaries of this region, the gold-skinned elves of the Direni clan stood atop high stone fortifications. The Direni wore overlapping plates of polished bronze and held tall staffs emitting crackling blue thermal energy. The human soldiers charged the fortifications, striking the heavy wooden gates with iron battering rams. The Direni pointed their staffs downward, releasing continuous streams of liquid fire that melted the iron rams and scorched the human armor. The heavy steel weapons of the humans bounced off the solid stone walls. The elves swung curved swords, cutting through the human infantry lines in the thick mud of the Glenumbra moors. The physical bodies of the human soldiers accumulated at the base of the walls, forcing the survivors to drop their heavy shields and run back toward the central plains. Inside the Central Empire, the grey-robed priests turned their iron weapons against one another. Different sects within the Alessian order fortified themselves inside the white marble temples, blocking the heavy wooden doors with massive stone blocks. They launched burning pitch through the high windows, igniting the wooden support beams of the opposing sect's strongholds. The roofs collapsed, crushing the priests beneath falling marble and burning timber. The physical infrastructure of the empire cracked along a deep geographical fault line. In the western Colovian hills, humans constructed thick, unadorned stone fortresses on the cliff edges. They forged heavy iron broadswords and hunted wild game across the rocky, elevated terrain, wrapping themselves in thick animal furs. In the eastern Nibanian valleys, humans wove brightly colored silk robes and tattooed their faces with red ink. They cultivated large fields of rice along the muddy riverbanks and wore intricate jewelry forged from imported gold. The organized distribution of grain, weapons, and quarried stone between the two regions stopped completely. The central continent remained divided by fortified checkpoints and armed border patrols, leaving the long coastal roads unmonitored and completely exposed to the massive fleets of longships arriving from the Eastern Ocean. A massive fleet of wooden ships, constructed without nails and bound entirely by woven reeds, emerged from the eastern fog. The figures navigating these vessels possessed lower halves extending into thick, muscular serpent coils, while their upper torsos resembled pale, hairless humans. These Akaviri invaders steered their ships into the northern rivers, dragging the hulls onto the snowy banks. They slithered onto the frozen earth, carrying long, curved swords forged from a light, flexible steel unknown to the continent. The Akaviri moved rapidly across the snow, their lower coils leaving wide, smooth tracks behind them as they bypassed the fortified human watchtowers completely. They struck the human settlements with swift, arching cuts, severing the heavy iron weapons of the Nords and sliding past their wide wooden shields. The invaders pushed directly southward, slicing through the northern defenders and aiming their columns toward the borders of the Central Empire. In the Colovian hills, a human general named Remen climbed atop a large boulder. He wore heavy plates of overlapping steel and carried a broad iron shield. He blew a long, sustained note on a polished ram's horn, and thousands of human soldiers from the divided western and eastern provinces marched into the valley below him. Remen struck his steel chest plate with his iron sword, vocalizing loud, rhythmic chants that synchronized the marching steps of the previously fractured human armies. He directed this unified force northward, moving them into a narrow, rocky canyon called Pale Pass. The humans stacked loose boulders along the steep cliff edges and waited for the invading serpents to enter the gorge. The Akaviri column slithered into the narrow pass, their curved swords drawn. Remen raised his arm and brought it down sharply. The human soldiers pushed the stacked boulders over the cliff edges. The heavy rocks crashed down into the gorge, crushing the long serpent coils and blocking the exit routes. Remen leaped down from the rocks, landing directly in front of the Akaviri commander. He inhaled deeply and expelled a loud, concussive vocalization directly at the invader. The physical force of the sound wave knocked the Akaviri commander backward onto the loose stones. The surviving Akaviri dropped their curved swords immediately. They recognized the concussive vocalization, slithering forward to press their pale faces against the dirt at Remen's metal boots. They pointed to his chest and vocalized the word Dragonborn. The Akaviri commander offered his flexible steel sword to Remen, signaling the complete submission of his entire force. Remen accepted the blade and integrated the surviving serpent men directly into his own ranks. He established the Second Empire, combining the heavy iron armor of the human soldiers with the swift, curved steel of the Akaviri to forge the first unified Imperial Legion. Remen directed this new, highly disciplined military force outward from the central valleys. The Legion marched in tight, uniform squares, holding their heavy shields close together to form a solid, moving wall of iron. They advanced into the dense southern jungles, hacking through the thick vines with their newly acquired curved blades. The Bosma dropped from the canopy to fire bone arrows, but the projectiles bounced off the interlocking steel plates of the legionnaires. The humans chopped down the massive, hollowed-out grat oaks, dragging the timber out of the jungle to construct wide, paved roads that connected the southern territories directly to the White Gold Tower. The subsequent rulers of Remen's bloodline, Remen I and Remen II, pushed the Legion even further. They marched the armored columns into the deep, stagnant waters of the eastern swamps. The heavy iron boots of the soldiers sank into the thick mud, and the local scaled bipeds utilized the deep water to ambush the supply lines. The Legion engineers responded by constructing elevated wooden causeways over the mud, driving thick iron pylons deep into the bedrock to support the wooden planks. They erected stone fortresses directly over the swamps, extending the physical infrastructure of the empire into the most hostile environments of the continent. In the high rocky peaks of the western mountains, a local population of humans and elves interbred over many generations, creating a distinct biological group with the physical height of humans and the pointed ears of the elves. These reachmen wrapped themselves in cured animal skins and carried weapons crafted from jagged black stone. They refused to submit to the Legion, ambushing the armored patrols from the high cliffs and rolling burning logs down onto the paved roads. During a particularly harsh winter, a human commander named Kastav ordered the Legion to requisition all the stored grain and salted meat from the northern settlements to feed the expanding army. The local Nords, facing complete starvation, picked up their iron axes and attacked the Legion's supply carts. The physical conflict spread rapidly across the snowy valleys, breaking the established supply chains and forcing the Legion to divert thousands of soldiers from the borders to suppress the internal rebellion. The supply carts returning from the borders rolled into the white gold tower, completely empty. The human soldiers guarding the checkpoints reported heavy losses against the continued Akaviri raids and the internal rebellions. Inside the imperial city, the Emperor Reman III walked across the marble floors wearing heavy iron plate armor over a silk tunic. He gripped a long steel broadsword and stood before the members of his council. To his immediate right stood his son, Julek, similarly armored. To his left stood the Akaviri potentate, Versidu Shaye, leaning on a curved silver sword. Reman III struck the table with his gauntlet, commanding the remaining legions to march eastward toward the borders of Morrowind. In the 80 years that followed, the human soldiers established fortified camps along the volcanic borders. They dug deep trenches in the ash and constructed thick wooden palisades. The Kaima warriors emerged from the grey fog, carrying long obsidian daggers and bone bows. The two armies engaged in continuous physical skirmishes across the rocky plains. The humans utilized massive steel battering rams to breach the Kaima mud brick walls, while the elves deployed controlled bursts of thermal magic to ignite the wooden siege engines. The physical bodies of soldiers from both sides accumulated in the deep trenches. The constant demand for fresh iron weapons and replacement armor severely depleted the iron reserves of the Central Empire. During the height of this prolonged conflict, a figure wrapped entirely in black linen walked silently through the imperial military encampment. He bypassed the iron-armored sentries and entered the main command tent. He approached Prince Julek, who sat unarmed, examining a map of the ash-covered plains. The figure pulled a thin, curved dagger forged from dark glass and drove the blade quickly through the prince's throat. The assassin dropped the weapon, exited the tent, and disappeared back into the thick fog before the guards discovered the bleeding body. Shortly after, the identical black-clad figure infiltrated the white gold tower in the capital. He bypassed the interior patrols, entered the Emperor's chambers, and drove a similar glass blade directly into the chest of Reman III. The assassin severed the Emperor's spinal column, leaving the body on the stone floor. The specific black garments and the identical dark glass weapons confirmed the assassinations were executed by the Morag Tong, a localized faction of Kaima assassins operating out of the eastern province. With the Reman bloodline physically terminated, Versidu Shaye climbed the stone steps to the central throne. He placed his coiled lower half onto the wide seat and gripped his curved silver sword. He issued a series of written edicts across the fractured empire, utilizing the existing Akaviri military infrastructure to assume direct control. He dispatched couriers carrying tightly rolled parchments to the provincial leaders, demanding immediate submission to his absolute authority. Versidou Shaye systematically restructured the physical operations of the empire. He outlawed local, independent human militias, confiscating their iron weapons and burning their wooden shields. To replace the local guards, he established the first heavily regulated professional guilds. He authorized the construction of localized stone guild halls in every major settlement. He permitted the Fighters Guild to forge their own steel weapons and train their own mercenaries within the enclosed courtyards of these halls. He directed the Mages Guild to gather the scattered magical texts and consolidate the teachings of thermal and kinetic magic within specific, guarded libraries. These distinct organizations operated directly under the authority of the potentate, physically separating the training of magic and combat from the general human population. After centuries of rule, another figure wrapped in black linen infiltrated the heavily guarded chambers of the White Gold Tower. This assassin bypassed the Akaviri sentries and drove a glass blade into the chest of Versidou Shaye. He carved the symbol of the Morag Tong directly into the wall, using the blood of the potentate. Years later, a synchronized group of assassins executed Severian Korak, the son of Versidou Shaye, and his entire immediate family within the same solar cycle. The rapid elimination of the central leadership fractured the remaining military infrastructure. The human generals, stripped of their localized militias and cut off from the central command, barricaded themselves inside their provincial stone fortresses. The Khmer border patrols pushed westward across the abandoned trenches. The Reachmen descended from the mountains, raiding the unmonitored supply lines. The unified paving stones connecting the empire physically crumbled under the weight of the localized skirmishes, marking the complete collapse of the Second Empire and the beginning of a prolonged period of violent physical division across the entire continent. Inside the massive stone walls of the imperial city, human warlords dragged heavy wooden siege towers across the cracked paving stones. They drove thick iron rams into the gates of the White Gold Tower, striking the metal hinges until they snapped. Men wearing dented steel chest plates sat upon the ruby throne for fractions of a lunar cycle before rival factions stormed the central chamber and severed their heads with iron axes. The continuous physical struggle for control over the central province drew massive, mobilized armies from the outer territories. To the northwest, a human named High King Emmerich stood on a stone battlement. He directed columns of heavily armored Bretons, Red Guards, and Orcs. These warriors carried broad steel swords and marched uniformly down the mountain passes, securing the western trade routes. In the frozen northeastern valleys, Joran the Skulled King struck a leather drum. Tall Nords wielding two-handed iron axes marched alongside dark-skinned Dunmer, casting localized thermal magic, and scaled Argonians carrying bone spears. In the southern jungles, Queen Iron stood at the prow of a wooden galleon. She pointed her crystal staff northward, commanding formations of gold-skinned Altmer, brown-skinned Bosmer, and furred Khajiit to push through the dense foliage. These three massive military alliances converged on the central plains of Cyrodiil, erecting canvas tents and launching heavy boulders from wooden catapults at the fortifications of their rivals. While the three alliances shattered stone walls and pierced flesh on the plains, a human named Clivia Tharn occupied the highest observation deck of the White Gold Tower. She stood next to an Altmer necromancer named Manimarco. Manimarco held a heavy iron dagger and sliced deep cuts across the arms of bound captives. He drained their dark red blood into a wide brass bowl and burned crushed black roots over the liquid. He directed low, vibrating vocalizations directly at the dark canopy of the sky, manipulating the magical frequencies to reach the specific jagged chasm of oblivion occupied by the Daedric entity Molag Bal. The sky above the imperial city split apart, exposing a swirling vortex of black clouds and glowing blue lightning. From the center of this vortex, massive chains forged from black iron plummeted downward. The individual links of these chains measured 50 feet across. The heavy metals slammed into the dirt, crushing the canvas tents of the warring factions and shattering the stone walls of the surrounding settlements. Thick, curved iron hooks at the ends of the chains penetrated the crust of the earth and locked tightly around the solid bedrock. Heavy mechanical gears, situated inside the black vortex, rotated, pulling the chains taut. The immense physical tension ripped massive chunks of dirt, stone, and water out of the ground, dragging entire sections of the physical plane upward toward the jagged chasm of Cold Harbor. As the earth lifted into the sky, towering bipedal reptiles with long snouts and thick rows of teeth dropped from the dark anchors. These daedroths exhaled concentrated streams of blue fire onto the human and elven soldiers below. Humanoid figures with skin the color of dried blood and heavy black horns protruding from their skulls followed the reptiles. These Dremora gripped heavy, serrated iron broadswords and severed the limbs of the Alliance warriors. The merging of the physical plane with the Oblivion chasm accelerated, cracking the continental plates and filling the air with the smell of burning ozone and vaporized blood. Deep within the jagged obsidian spikes of Cold Harbor, a mortal prisoner lay upon a cold stone slab. A Daedric torturer had recently extracted this prisoner's vital essence, leaving the body with pale, translucent skin and glowing blue eyes. The soulless prisoner pushed off the stone slab, picked up a discarded iron mace, and struck the skull of the nearby Daedric guard. The prisoner sprinted across bridges formed of floating rock and black chains, locating a blind human named Varen Aquilarios locked inside a rusted iron cage. The prisoner shattered the iron lock with the mace, pulling Varen out of the enclosure. The two figures located a glowing blue fissure in the obsidian ground, a direct spatial tear connecting back to the physical world. They jumped into the fissure, dropping through the portal and crashing onto the soft mud of the central continent. The escaped prisoner traveled rapidly across the war-torn plains, gathering a small group of heavily armed warriors. This group tracked the locations of the falling black chains. They charged the anchor sites, driving steel axes into the knees of the Dremora and projecting bursts of kinetic magic to shatter the heavy iron hooks holding the bedrock. As the hooks snapped, the rotating gears in the sky released their tension, and the massive chunks of earth plummeted back down, slamming into the craters and settling into the crust. The warriors pushed their offensive directly into the imperial city, climbing the steps of the white gold tower. They struck Manimako with heavy steel blades, severing his hands and breaking his concentration. The prisoner utilized a specialized amulet containing concentrated light to project a massive beam of thermal energy directly into the black vortex. The beam physically dissolved the remaining chains and forced the jagged chasm to close, sealing the sky and trapping Molag Bal behind the dark canopy. The massive iron chains degraded into piles of rust, and the physical plane stabilized, leaving the central continent covered in deep craters, burned forests, and shattered stone fortresses. The three military alliances completely depleted their supply lines, their soldiers dropping their bent swords and retreating to their respective provinces. The imperial city lay in ruins, its marble plazas stained with blood, and its heavy wooden gates reduced to splinters. The ruby throne remained completely vacant, covered in a thick layer of grey ash. The surviving humans and elves scavenged for grain in the destroyed valleys, waiting for someone to rebuild the paved roads. High in the snowy northern mountains, a human general named Hjalti Earlybeard strapped heavy steel plates over his chest, fastened a woolen cloak around his shoulders, and directed his own highly trained legions to march down the freezing slopes toward the vacant capital. Hjalti Earlybeard marched his heavy infantry out of the northern mountains. These human soldiers wore thick steel plates over padded leather tunics and carried broad iron shields bearing a red diamond emblem. They pushed down onto the central plains, using long wooden pikes to clear the Kima and Reachman raiding parties from the paved roads. Hjalti directed his troops to secure the shattered walls of the imperial city. The soldiers cleared the piles of bone and broken marble from the central plazas, establishing a heavily fortified base around the base of the white gold tower. Hjalti claimed the title of emperor, adopting the name Tiber Septim, and initiated a massive physical campaign to reunify the entire continent under a single central authority. The Imperial Legion expanded rapidly under Septim's command. He integrated highly specialized units into his infantry columns, including Breton cavalry riding heavily armored war horses and Redguard swordsmen wielding curved steel blades. The legion marched westward into the rocky hills of High Rock and the sandy deserts of Hammerfell. They drove iron siege towers against the local fortresses, using heavy battering rams to shatter the reinforced wooden gates. Septim's forces overwhelmed the localized militias through sheer numerical advantage and synchronized military tactics, securing the western provinces and establishing permanent stone garrisons along the trade routes. Following the western campaign, Septim turned his armies toward the southern jungles. The thick canopy and dense undergrowth hindered the movement of his heavy cavalry and siege engines. The Bosmer and Khajiit defenders utilized the environment, firing poisoned bone arrows from the high branches and dropping heavy logs onto the narrow jungle paths. Septim responded by deploying specialized units of Imperial battle mages. These magic users wore robes woven with protective metallic threads and carried staffs tipped with glowing red crystals. They projected concentrated streams of thermal energy into the dense foliage, incinerating the thick vines and clearing wide swaths of the jungle. The fire exposed the hidden elven settlements, allowing the heavy infantry to march directly into the clearings and secure the southern territories. The eastern province of Morrowind, controlled by the Kima, now physically altered and known as the Dunmer, following the events at Red Mountain, presented a significant military obstacle. The harsh volcanic terrain and the presence of the tribunal, the three living gods who drew power from Lorcan's heart, deterred a direct infantry assault. Septim moved his legions to the western borders of the Ash Plains, positioning his siege engines and establishing a heavily fortified defensive line. He dispatched heavily armed diplomatic envoys across the border, initiating a prolonged series of physical negotiations with the tribunal. The resulting armistice integrated Morrowind into the Empire, while allowing the Dunmer to retain their localized religious practices and internal governance structures. During these negotiations, Septim acquired a massive dormant brass construct from the tribunal. The Dwemer mechanics had originally assembled this towering machine, the Numidium, inside the volcanic caverns. Septim transported the disjointed brass limbs, heavy gears, and hollow chest cavity back to the imperial city. His own engineers, supervised by an imperial battle mage named Zurin Arctus, reconstructed the massive brass figure within a highly secured underground facility. Lacking the heart of Lorcan to power the construct, Arctus forged a massive, glowing green gem called the Mantella. He extracted a significant portion of his own vital essence, channeling the raw magical energy into the gem and inserting it directly into the chest cavity of the Numidium. The massive brass construct activated, emitting a low, vibrating hum that shook the foundations of the white gold tower. Septim deployed the Numidium against the final independent province, the Ultima stronghold of the Somerset Isles. The towering brass machine waded across the ocean channels, its heavy metal feet crushing the coral reefs and displacing massive volumes of water. The Ultima defenders launched volleys of crystal arrows and concentrated light beams from their coastal spires, but the projectiles shattered against the thick brass plating of the construct. The Numidium projected devastating waves of kinetic and thermal energy, leveling the white limestone towers and shattering the crystal spires of the island settlements. The sheer physical destruction forced the Ultima to surrender, completing the total subjugation of the continent. With all provinces secured, Tiber Septim established the Third Empire. He standardized the currency, minting circular gold coins bearing his own profile. The Imperial Legion maintained a continuous, highly visible presence across the continent, enforcing a rigid set of physical laws and suppressing local rebellions with overwhelming military force. This period of enforced stability, marked by the rapid expansion of imperial infrastructure, became known as the Third Era. Inside the central chamber of the white gold tower, the human Emperor Uriel Septim positioned his heavy leather boots on the polished marble floor. He wore thick plates of overlapping gold armor and rested a heavy crown embedded with large, faceted red diamonds upon his head. An imperial battle mage carrying the designation Jagger Tharn walked across the room, gripping a long wooden staff topped with a large, pulsing purple crystal. Tharn stopped directly in front of the Emperor, lifted the staff, and pointed the crystal toward the heavy gold armor. Tharn opened his mouth and projected a series of loud, vibrating vocalizations. The purple crystal flared, discharging a concentrated beam of light that struck the center of Uriel's chest. The physical space surrounding the Emperor folded inward, pulling his body through a spatial tear. Uriel dropped out of the air and crashed onto the jagged, freezing rocks of a dark, isolated chasm within oblivion. Thick, rusted iron chains emerged from the surrounding black water, coiling tightly around Uriel's wrists and ankles, locking his physical body to the stone ground. Back in the illuminated throne room, Tharn dragged his bare hands down his own cheeks. His facial bones audibly cracked and shifted their structure. His skin altered its pigmentation, adopting the exact pale tone of the displaced emperor. His hair shortened and turned a lighter shade of brown, completing a total physical imitation of Uriel Septim. Tharn retrieved the heavy gold crown from the marble floor, placed it securely onto his newly shaped skull, and gripped the wooden staff with both hands. He struck the crystal head against the stone pillar. The solid wood fractured, splitting into 8 jagged splinters. Tharn dropped these fragments into individual iron lockboxes, bolted the lids shut, and handed them to heavily armored couriers. He directed these riders to transport the lockboxes to the furthest edges of the continent. The couriers buried the boxes deep inside active volcanic vents, submerged coastal ruins, and glacial caverns. They stacked massive boulders over the entrances and positioned reanimated, fleshless skeletons holding rusted iron swords to guard the perimeters. Tharn descended the stone staircases into the deepest subterranean levels of the tower. He located his apprentice, a human female named Rhea Silmain, and drove a steel dagger through her ribcage. He instructed the armored sentries to drag the remaining human witnesses into the lowest iron cells, dropping heavy metal bars across the exits. Inside one of these lightless, damp enclosures, a solitary human prisoner pressed his back against the cold dirt wall. A glowing, semi-translucent apparition of Rhea Silman materialized directly through the iron bars. The glowing figure extended a translucent finger toward a loose, rectangular stone near the floor. The prisoner dropped to his knees, dug his fingers into the mortar, and pulled the heavy granite block out of the wall. He extracted a forged iron key from the cavity. He inserted the key into the heavy iron lock of the cell door, rotated the metal pins, and pushed the heavy barrier open. The prisoner grabbed a discarded steel shortsword from a wooden table, drove the blade into the necks of the armored sentries, and climbed the winding stone stairs to the surface. The escaped prisoner walked across the paved roads of the continent, tracking the exact coordinates of the buried iron lockboxes. He trekked up the freezing, snow-covered slopes of the northern mountains. He swung his steel blade, severing the cervical vertebrae of the skeletal guards and pulling the first wooden splinter from a block of solid ice. He marched into the eastern swamps, wading through stagnant, waist-deep mud, scaled bipeds through bone spears, and the prisoner deflected the projectiles with a wooden shield, crushing the skulls of the attackers with a heavy iron mace to retrieve the second fragment from a sunken stone altar. He repeated this physical extraction process 6 times across the blistering sand deserts and humid southern jungles, storing the 8 wooden splinters inside a thick leather sack. Sitting beside a roaring campfire on the central plains, the prisoner pressed the jagged edges of the 8 wood fragments together. The residual magical sap inside the timber heated and fused the splinters back into a single, continuous staff, topped with the pulsing purple crystal. Gripping the reassembled weapon, the prisoner marched back into the imperial city. He approached the white gold tower, channeling kinetic force through the crystal to blow the heavy iron doors off their hinges. He stepped into the throne room, pointing the glowing staff at Jagar Tharn. Tharn extended his hands, expelling streams of liquid fire that scorched the prisoner's leather tunic and blackened the marble pillars. The prisoner ran forward through the thermal waves, swung the heavy wooden staff in a wide arc, and struck the side of Tharn's skull. The physical impact cracked the bone, instantly breaking the biological alteration. Tharn's face warped back into its original shape as his body collapsed onto the stones, leaking dark blood and coming to a complete physical halt. The prisoner struck the crystal head of the staff against the floor. A vertical tear opened in the air, emitting a bright purple glow. The emaciated, shivering body of Uriel Septim tumbled out of the rift and struck the marble. The emperor wore tattered, filthy cloth, and his hair had turned completely white from the extreme cold and harsh atmosphere of the Oblivion Chasm. The prisoner gripped Uriel's shoulders, hoisted him onto his feet, and placed the gold crown back upon his head. Uriel Septim reclaimed the central throne and immediately dispatched columns of armored cavalry to re-establish control over his fractured supply lines. Imperial couriers carrying sealed parchment orders spurred their heavy war horses toward the rocky cliffs of the western Iliac Bay. Deep within those western hills, localized factions of human kings directed their own workers to dig massive trenches into the earth. These workers hauled massive brass limbs and heavy bronze gears out of the dirt, connecting the metal joints together and preparing to ignite the dormant furnaces of a towering mechanical giant. A small wooden prison ship dropped its heavy iron anchor into the murky green water along the southwestern coast of Vardenfell. A human guard wearing overlapping steel plates shoved a lone prisoner down a wooden ramp. The prisoner stepped onto the damp wooden docks of Seyda. Thick grey ash fell continuously from the massive central volcano, coating the wooden planks and the prisoner's coarse linen tunic. This individual walked northward across the rocky, barren plains, navigating through violent ash storms and crossing dried lava channels. The prisoner approached the massive bronze doors of the subterranean Dwemer ruins, pushing them open to retrieve specific metal artifacts left behind centuries earlier. He grasped the heavy handle of the iron hammer Sunder and picked up the blue crystal blade Keening. Armed with these tonal tools, the prisoner descended into the deepest, sweltering basalt caverns beneath Red Mountain. He located the massive, pulsing red mass of Lorcan's heart, suspended above a pool of boiling magma. The prisoner swung the iron hammer directly into the center of the bleeding organ, producing a concussive auditory blast. He followed the strike by dragging the sharp edge of the crystal blade across the thick tissue. The red mass shrank rapidly, pulling inward until the flesh completely dissolved into the hot air, leaving the iron restraints hanging empty over the bubbling lava. On the surface of the continent, the destruction of the heart triggered an immediate biological reaction in the three living gods of the Dunmer. Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek stood in their respective stone palaces. The bright, radiating halos of light surrounding their skulls sputtered and extinguished entirely. The magical levitation supporting Vivek failed, dropping his heavy boots flat onto the marble floor. Their bodies aged rapidly, their skin wrinkling and their bones growing brittle. Almalexia descended into a dark, gear-filled subterranean chamber and drove a steel broadsword through the chest of Sothasil, leaving his bleeding body slumped over a bronze operating table. The prisoner from the wooden ship followed her into the brass tunnels and swung a heavy iron longsword, slicing through Almalexia's neck and dropping her severed head onto the metal grating. A few solar cycles passed, shifting the physical focus back to the central imperial city. Deep underneath the white gold tower, cold water dripped down the curving brick walls of the subterranean sewer system. The Emperor Uriel Septim walked through the ankle-deep muck, escorted by 3 guards, clad in heavy steel armor and carrying burning pitch torches. The shadows shifted along the damp brick. Human assassins wearing bright red robes leaped from the dark alcoves, gripping curved swords and serrated iron daggers. The guards swung their heavy steel broadswords, severing the limbs of the attackers and splashing thick red blood across the sewer walls. One assassin bypassed the armored escorts, lunged forward, and drove a dagger directly into the center of the Emperor's chest. Uriel Septim collapsed into the dirty water. A nearby escaped prisoner knelt in the mud and pulled the heavy amulet of kings from the dead Emperor's neck. Simultaneously, the physical crust of the continent ruptured. Jagged rings of black obsidian erupted from the dirt in every province. The empty space inside these rings ignited, opening swirling portals of bright orange fire. The air around the rings smelled heavily of burning sulfur and charred meat. Towering humanoid figures with dark red skin and heavy black horns stepped through the flames, gripping massive iron maces and serrated broadswords. These Daedric invaders marched into the surrounding valleys, swinging their weapons to crush the skulls of the local farmers and setting the wooden thatch roofs ablaze with concentrated streams of fire. The prisoner who retrieved the amulet traveled rapidly to a remote stone chapel to locate a human priest named Martin Septim. The 2 men rode heavily armored horses back to the imperial city, pushing through the burning wooden barricades and the advancing lines of red-skinned invaders. They reached the central plaza surrounding the white gold tower. The heavy clouds above the plaza parted, and an enormous entity stepped down onto the paving stones. The creature possessed dark red skin, 4 heavily muscled arms, and stood 50 feet tall. This Daedric prince, Mehrunes Dagon, swung a massive double-bladed axe, shattering the white marble columns and crushing the screaming human soldiers under his heavy, hooved feet. Martin Septim ran into the center of the ruined Temple of the One. He gripped the Amulet of Kings in both hands and smashed the large red diamond against the stone altar. The crystal shattered into hundreds of jagged fragments. Torrents of blinding yellow and orange fire poured out of the broken gem, wrapping entirely around Martin's body. The intense heat incinerated his flesh and bone, replacing his human frame with the massive, scaled body of a towering golden dragon. The winged reptile expanded its chest and lunged at the 4-armed giant. The golden dragon clamped its massive jaws directly into the thick neck of Mehrunes Dagon, driving its long fangs through the red skin. The dragon released a continuous, blinding stream of white fire into the wound. The extreme thermal energy pushed the giant backward, causing Dagon's physical form to dissolve entirely into falling ash and orange sparks. The golden dragon climbed the side of the stone temple, reared its horned head toward the sky, and emitted a deafening roar. The bright golden scales rapidly lost their luster, turning gray and hardening into solid rock. The creature became a permanent stone statue fused to the temple roof. Across the continent, the rings of orange fire snapped shut, leaving behind empty rings of cold obsidian. The bloodline of the Dragon Kings terminated entirely, leaving the central throne empty, while a massive, suspended boulder hanging over the eastern ash plains began to vibrate and crack, preparing to fall directly onto the city below. Inside the Iliac Bay excavation site, hundreds of workers strapped thick leather harnesses to the massive brass limbs of the Numidium. They drove iron spikes into the rock walls and operated heavy wooden pulleys, slowly hoisting the metal legs out of the deep trenches. The workers bolted the torso onto the lower assembly using massive iron rivets. An Imperial agent, sent directly by Uriel Septim, descended the wooden scaffolding carrying the glowing green mantella gem. The agent pushed the gem into the open chest cavity of the construct. The internal furnaces ignited instantly, blowing thick clouds of black exhaust out of the brass pipes on the machine's back. The Numidium stood upright, its heavy metal joints screeching as they ground together. The human kings of the Iliac Bay watched the activation from their stone fortresses. King Gothrid of Daggerfall, King Eadwire of Wayrest, and King Gortwog of Orsinium simultaneously mobilized their distinct military forces. Breton cavalry charged across the paved roads holding long steel lances, while heavily armored orcs marched down the mountain paths swinging massive iron battle axes. The 3 armies converged on the excavation site, driving their weapons into the Imperial Legion soldiers guarding the perimeter. The physical clash involved thousands of bodies crashing together, staining the rocky dirt with thick red blood and scattering broken shields across the valley. During the height of the physical combat, the Numidium activated its primary offensive mechanisms. The brass giant raised its massive metal arms, projecting a wide, continuous wave of concussive force across the battlefield. The sound wave hit the human and orcish soldiers, physically flattening their bodies against the rocks and crushing their steel armor inward. At that exact moment, the chronological continuity of the physical plane ruptured. The localized time around the Iliac Bay split into distinct, overlapping timelines. The Imperial agent, standing on the scaffolding, observed 6 different outcomes occurring simultaneously. He watched King Gothrid seize control of the brass giant in one timeline, while simultaneously watching King Aedwire command it in another. In a third timeline, the Orcs of Orsinium successfully claimed the machine. The physical events piled on top of each other, creating a dense, confusing blur of overlapping bodies, shattering weapons, and shifting terrain. This chronological overlap persisted for several solar cycles, known to the scribes as the warp in the west. During this localized dragon break, the Numidium projected multiple blasts of thermal and kinetic energy across the western provinces in every timeline simultaneously. The brass giant leveled the smaller stone fortresses, completely incinerating the surrounding forests and redirecting the flow of the major rivers. The sheer physical destruction eliminated the dozens of minor kings and warlords who had previously divided the region. When the chronological rupture ended, the multiple timelines collapsed back into a single, linear sequence. The physical landscape of the Iliac Bay settled into a new configuration. The dozens of small, fractured territories had been physically merged into three massive, distinct kingdoms: Daggerfall, Wayrest, and Orsinium. The borders between these new kingdoms were clearly defined by deep, newly carved riverbeds and high ridges of bare rock. The minor kings were dead, their bodies buried under the shifted dirt. The three surviving monarchs immediately swore physical fealty to the imperial city, dropping their iron swords to the ground and bowing their heads before the emperor's envoys. The Numidium, having exhausted the massive magical energy required to sustain the multiple timelines, completely shut down. The glowing green light of the mantella flickered and faded to a dull grey. The massive brass construct collapsed onto the rocky ground, its heavy limbs snapping apart under their own weight. The internal furnaces cooled, and the bronze plates immediately began to oxidize and rust in the damp air. Back in the white gold tower, Uriel Septim sat on the ruby throne, reviewing the incoming reports from the western provinces. He recorded the successful consolidation of the Iliac Bay onto fresh parchment scrolls, using black ink to mark the new, stable borders. The Empire regained physical control over the region without deploying additional legions. The Emperor stamped the scrolls with the red diamond seal in hot wax, securing the western flank of the continent, while preparing to turn his attention eastward toward the ash-covered plains of Morrowind. The massive boulder suspended above the stone pyramids of Vivec City cracked directly down its center. The localized magical field holding the rock in place collapsed entirely, following the physical departure of the living god Vivec. The enormous mass of stone plummeted downward, accelerating through the damp air. It struck the central water plaza of the city with the exact momentum and physical velocity it possessed when it initially entered the atmosphere centuries prior. The sheer kinetic impact instantly shattered the multi-tiered stone cantons into jagged fragments, vaporizing the surrounding canals into thick columns of scalding steam. A massive shockwave rolled outward across the Vardenfell landmass, ripping giant trees from the soil and leveling the mud-brick settlements of the Dunmer. The kinetic shockwave struck the deep subterranean base of the central volcano, fracturing the thick tectonic plates, holding the internal magma chambers intact. The entire peak of Red Mountain detonated outward. Millions of tons of liquid rock, boiling grey ash, and sharp obsidian fragments shot vertically into the upper atmosphere. Dow. The heavy ash rained back down over the continent, burying the towering fungus forests and choking the coastal cities under several feet of dark soot. Rivers of fast-moving, glowing lava poured down the slopes, incinerating the chitin-armored elves as they ran toward the coastlines. The boiling rock flowed directly into the inner sea, heating the ocean water until it bubbled and scalded the wooden hulls of the refugee ships fleeing the destruction. The dense volcanic fallout drifted across the sky, coating the eastern regions of the central continent in a permanent layer of dark, abrasive dust. In the humid southern swamps of Black Marsh, the scaled bipeds, designated as Argonians, observed the thick grey ash blocking the sunlight. Guided by the dripping sap of their massive, localized hiss trees, the Argonians formed heavily armed military columns. They gripped steel-tipped spears and marched out of the deep mud, crossing the border directly into the burning ruins of Morrowind. The Argonians scaled the collapsed stone walls of the Dunmer agricultural estates. They drove their spears through the chests of the surviving elven slavers, extracting physical retribution for the iron collars placed around their necks by previous elven generations. The scaled warriors ignited the remaining Dunmer outposts with burning pitch, claiming the southern territories of the Ash Plains and forcing the surviving dark-skinned elves to flee westward into the freezing snowfields of Skyrim. In the central province of Cyrodiil, the marble plazas of the imperial city remained covered in broken glass and dried blood from the recent Daedric invasion. Following the physical termination of the ruling bloodline, local human warlords marched their fragmented militias across the paved roads, swinging iron axes at each other to claim the unoccupied capital. A Colovian warlord named Titus Mede separated from these warring factions. He strapped thick iron plates over his chest and rode a heavy warhorse at the head of a highly disciplined, heavily armed infantry force. Mede's soldiers carried tall wooden ladders and heavy steel broadswords. They bypassed the main thoroughfares, crossed the surrounding lake on flat-bottomed wooden barges, and placed their ladders against the high, white stone walls of the imperial city. Mede's soldiers climbed over the barricades, dropping onto the marble streets and driving their steel blades into the localized militias occupying the plazas. They locked their wooden shields together, forming an impenetrable wall that pushed the opposing forces out of the city gates, sliding the heavy iron deadbolts into place to secure the perimeter. Titus Mede walked up the stone steps of the white gold tower, pushed open the massive double doors, and approached the ruby throne. He removed his iron gauntlets, wiped the thick layer of accumulated grey ash from the seat, and sat down. He deployed his armored columns outward, ordering his commanders to rebuild the military checkpoints along the central trade routes and enforce his absolute physical control over the surrounding human settlements. While the human soldiers repaired the cracked paving stones in the center of the continent, the gold-skinned Altmer on the distant Somerset Isles initiated a distinct sequence of physical isolation. A specific faction of these elves, wearing long black robes embroidered with gold thread, marched through the white limestone towers of their island cities. These elves carried curved glass swords and severed the heads of any local leader who communicated with the human empire. They lowered heavy iron portcullises over their coastal ports, dropping thick metal grates into the water to physically intercept any incoming wooden merchant vessels. Behind these closed gates, they melted down their decorative gold statues, forging thousands of new weapons and organizing their archers into tight, marching formations. They hoisted massive canvas sails on their newly constructed warships, outfitting the wooden decks with heavy ballistae and preparing to launch their massive fleets across the narrow sea channels. The Altmeri admirals directed their wooden fleets out of the Somerset Isles, crossing the narrow sea channels to land on the southern shores of the central continent. They unloaded heavy ballistae and advanced along the paved roads, firing massive iron bolts into the imperial garrisons and splintering the wooden palisades. The Bosmer and Khajiit populations emerged from the jungles, abandoning their allegiance to the empire and marching alongside the arriving Altmer columns. The combined forces dismantled the imperial checkpoints, burning the red diamond banners and re-establishing the Aldmeri dominion across the southern provinces. Following this rapid territorial loss, the Emperor Titus Mede II sat at the heavy oak table in the white gold tower, reviewing maps of the diminishing imperial borders. He dispatched his remaining legions southward, outfitting the human soldiers with heavy steel plating and long halberds. The imperial infantry engaged the advancing Dominion forces across the flat fields of Cyrodiil. The elves utilized concentrated thermal magic to melt the imperial steel, while the human soldiers drove their halberds into the unarmored chests of the Altmer mages. The fighting left deep furrows in the mud and scattered broken weapons across the entire southern border. During the height of this physical conflict, known as the Great War, the Dominion deployed a specialized infiltration unit. These elves bypassed the main infantry lines, scaling the white stone walls of the imperial city under the cover of night. They moved through the marble streets, setting fire to the wooden merchant stalls and the surrounding residential buildings. The Altmer broke down the heavy doors of the central tower and marched directly into the throne room, carrying long glass swords. They severed the heads of the imperial guards and hoisted the golden eagle banner of the Dominion over the capital, physically forcing Titus Mede II to mount his warhorse and flee northward into the snowy mountains. Mede regrouped his surviving legions in the northern valleys, reorganizing his infantry into tight, mobile formations. He waited for the heavy winter snows to melt before directing his army back down the mountain passes. The imperial soldiers slammed their battering rams into the sealed gates of their own capital city. They breached the perimeter, pushing into the burning plazas and striking the Altmer occupiers with heavy iron broadswords. The physical combat continued for several solar cycles, filling the streets with elven and human bodies. Mede's forces eventually cleared the central tower, pulling down the eagle banners and re-securing the ruby throne. The heavy physical losses on both sides forced Mede and the Dominion commanders to meet at a stone table outside the city walls. They signed a heavy parchment document called the White Gold Concordat. This treaty mandated specific physical changes across the empire. The imperial couriers traveled to every province, distributing orders to dismantle all shrines dedicated to Tiber Septim, now known as Talos. The human guards entered the stone chapels, striking the iron statues of Talos with heavy hammers and dragging the broken metal out of the settlements. Furthermore, the treaty authorized Dominion agents, designated as the Thalmor, to patrol the human provinces, wearing distinct black robes and carrying glass daggers. The Thalmor agents apprehended any human caught possessing a Talos amulet, placing iron shackles around their wrists and marching them into mobile wooden cages. In the northern province of Skyrim, the local Jarls observed the imperial guards breaking the statues of their patron deity. A Nord named Ulfric Stormcloak stood in the stone hall of Windhelm, gripping a heavy steel axe. He vocalized loud, concussive shouts, refusing to comply with the treaty and demanding the immediate expulsion of the Thalmor from the snowfields. Ulfric marched his militia toward the central city of Solitude. He confronted the High King of Skyrim, Torrig, in the open courtyard. Ulfric inhaled deeply and expelled a massive kinetic wave from his throat. The localized Thuum struck Torrig, shattering his ribs and throwing his body backward against the stone wall. Ulfric then stepped forward and drove his steel sword into the king's chest, ending the brief physical encounter and immediately fleeing the city gates on horseback. This specific action triggered an immediate, localized civil war across the northern province. The Nords of Skyrim divided into two distinct factions. The Stormcloaks, wearing padded blue tunics and carrying iron axes, established fortified camps in the eastern pine forests, aiming to completely sever Skyrim from the Empire. The Imperial Legion, wearing standardized red and steel armor, fortified the western stone cities, aiming to crush the rebellion and maintain the unified continental borders. The two armies engaged in continuous physical combat across the frozen valleys, burning the wooden bridges and blocking the mountain passes with heavy stone barricades. The constant military focus on the civil war left the ancient, jagged peaks of the highest mountains completely unmonitored. Deep beneath the packed snow of these isolated peaks, the physical crust of the earth began to heat rapidly. The frozen dirt cracked open, exposing deep, circular craters previously excavated during the Dawn era. The snow melted into muddy water, flowing down the steep inclines and exposing large, heavy mounds of dark, overlapping scales. The frozen ground surrounding the throat of the world buckled and cracked open. The massive, winged reptile known as Alduin pushed his heavy, spiked head through the melting snow. He dragged his thick, black-scaled body out of the crater, his serrated claws gripping the jagged granite of the mountain peak. He expanded his massive chest cavity and expelled a continuous stream of dark fire, vaporizing the surrounding glaciers. The force of his exit triggered physical avalanches across the mountain range, sending thousands of tons of compacted snow crashing down into the pine valleys below. Alduin lifted his heavy wings and propelled himself into the freezing air. He tracked the scent of dried bone and decayed flesh to a series of circular stone burial mounds scattered across the northern tundra. These mounds contained the skeletal remains of the other dragons killed by the human armies during the Dawn era. Alduin landed heavily on the frosted stones, opened his wide jaws, and emitted a sequence of localized, low-frequency vocalizations. The sound waves penetrated the frozen dirt, vibrating the buried bones. The fragmented skeletons fused back together, the heavy dust reforming into thick scales and leathery wing membranes. One by one, the resurrected dragons burst through the topsoil, shaking the dirt from their wings and taking flight alongside the black dragon. In the southern region of the province, an imperial horse-drawn wagon rolled over the cobblestones toward the fortified execution block of Helgen. The wagon carried a bound prisoner wearing a coarse grey tunic and thick iron shackles around their wrists. As the wagon stopped, the prisoner stepped down onto the stone courtyard. An imperial headsman, wearing a black leather hood, gripped a heavy steel battle-axe, pushing the prisoner's bare neck flat against a stained wooden block. Before the steel blade descended, Alduin dropped from the low clouds and slammed onto the stone watchtower above the courtyard. The dragon exhaled a massive torrent of liquid fire, incinerating the headsman and the surrounding guards. The physical impact of the dragon shattered the stone tower, showering the courtyard in heavy granite debris. The prisoner stood up, slipped the iron shackles off their wrists in the chaos, and sprinted through the burning wooden gates, escaping into the dense pine forests. This escaped prisoner tracked a group of human soldiers to a stone watchtower outside the central trade hub of Whiterun. A resurrected bronze dragon swooped down, tearing the wooden roof off the tower and snapping its jaws around the armored soldiers. The prisoner gripped a steel broadsword, rushed forward, and drove the blade directly into the exposed joints of the dragon's wing. The reptile collapsed onto the dirt, and the prisoner brought the heavy steel blade down, severing the spinal column at the base of the skull. Immediately following the physical death of the beast, a concentrated stream of bright orange energy poured out of the dragon's corpse and flowed directly into the prisoner's chest. The scales and flesh of the reptile rapidly dissolved into ash, leaving behind only the bleached skeletal structure. The human soldiers, observing this physical transfer of energy, vocalized the term dragonborn, recognizing the biological capacity of the prisoner to absorb the vital essence of the massive reptiles. The prisoner inhaled the freezing air and expelled a focused, concussive wave of kinetic force from their vocal cords, knocking the remaining soldiers off their feet and confirming their newly acquired thuthum. Following the sound of the vocalization, a group of elderly human monks wrapped in thick grey robes descended from a stone sanctuary located near the mountain's summit. These monks, designated the Greybeards, guided the dragonborn up the thousands of carved stone steps. They instructed the prisoner to study the physical etchings on ancient stone walls, teaching them the precise tongue and jaw movements required to manipulate the magical frequencies. Armed with a variety of specialized vocalizations and heavy steel weapons, the dragonborn actively hunted the resurrected reptiles across the snowy province. The prisoner tracked a massive frost dragon to a frozen lake, using concentrated blasts of thermal vocalizations to melt the ice beneath the beast and pinning its heavy wings in the freezing water before driving a longsword into its skull. The dragonborn absorbed the essence of dozens of dragons, increasing the physical force and variety of their vocal abilities. Eventually, the dragonborn located the specific geographical coordinates of the ancient portal used to banish Alduin. They stood ankle-deep in the snow at the highest peak and engaged the black dragon in direct physical combat. The dragonborn deflected streams of dark fire with a heavy steel shield and expelled overlapping kinetic shouts that physically grounded the massive beast. Utilizing a specialized vocalization that temporarily forced the dragon to experience the physical limitations of a mortal body, the dragonborn drove a glowing, enchanted broadsword directly through the thick black scales of Alduin's chest. The black dragon's physical form shattered violently, dissolving into thousands of dark, glowing embers that floated upward into the freezing sky. The remaining resurrected dragons scattered across the continent, taking roost on isolated peaks, leaving the dragonborn standing alone on the frozen summit as the heavy snows began to fall over the shattered stones once again. The frozen dirt covering the slopes of the northern mountains completely gave way. Dozens of resurrected dragons shook the thick ice from their leathery wings and launched themselves into the freezing air. They circled the jagged peaks, their massive jaws open, releasing long streams of liquid fire that scorched the surrounding pine forests. The heavy smoke from the burning trees drifted over the stone walls of the human settlements below. The local Nords watched the winged reptiles pass over their watchtowers, grasping their iron broadswords tightly. Inside the thick stone walls of solitude, the Imperial Legion generals gathered around a large wooden map table. They wore heavy red cloaks over their segmented steel armor. They moved carved wooden markers across the map, representing the deployment of their remaining infantry columns. They directed these soldiers to establish heavily fortified camps along the paved roads, digging deep trenches into the permafrost and erecting solid wooden palisades to block the mountain passes. The generals received continuous reports from their scouts regarding the movements of the Stormcloak militias. In the eastern city of Windhelm, Ulfric Stormcloak sat on a wide throne carved directly from a massive block of grey granite. He wore a thick cloak woven from bear fur over his iron chainmail. He addressed his gathered commanders, pointing his steel axe toward the western territories on his own map. Ulfric's commanders mobilized the local human population, handing out heavy iron warhammers and round wooden shields painted with the blue bear insignia of their faction. These Stormcloak soldiers marched out of the city gates, leaving the high stone walls of Windhelm behind to secure the snow-covered valleys. The two armies collided on the frozen plains outside the central trade hub of Whiterun. The Imperial soldiers formed tight, disciplined lines, locking their heavy steel shields together to create a solid metal barrier. The Stormcloaks charged across the snow, swinging their iron axes with immense physical force, shattering the wooden shafts of the Imperial spears and denting the steel shields. The physical clash sent deep vibrations through the frozen dirt, the sound of metal striking metal echoing across the tundra. The fighting continued for several hours, leaving the snow stained dark red and the ground littered with broken iron and severed limbs. While the human soldiers tore into one another, the Dragonborn pushed through the heavy wooden doors of a secluded stone fortress built directly into the side of a steep mountain. This structure housed a covert faction of human warriors carrying the designation of the Blades. These warriors wore segmented armor forged from overlapping plates of Akaviri steel and carried long, slightly curved katanas. The Dragonborn presented a large, etched stone tablet retrieved from an ancient burial mound to the leader of the Blades, an older human named Delphine. The two examined the tablet, translating the physical carvings to determine the exact flight paths and nesting locations of the resurrected dragons. Armed with this specific geographical data, the Dragonborn traveled across the northern province, tracking the dragons to their lairs. They climbed the sheer rock faces, securing handholds in the freezing granite. Upon reaching the summit nests, the Dragonborn engaged the massive reptiles directly. They deflected the streams of fire with a heavy steel shield and expelled concussive vocalizations that grounded the beasts. The Dragonborn drove an enchanted broadsword through the thick scales of the dragons, absorbing their vital essence and leaving the bleached skeletons scattered across the mountain peaks. As the number of active dragons dwindled, the Dragonborn returned to the central plains. They walked directly onto the battlefield outside Whiterun, stepping over the frozen bodies of the fallen Imperial and Stormcloak soldiers. The Dragonborn approached the commanding officers of both factions, demanding a temporary cessation of the physical hostilities to address the remaining threat of the Black Dragon, Alduin. The generals, recognizing the physical destruction caused by the dragons and the proven capabilities of the Dragonborn, ordered their soldiers to lower their weapons. The leaders of the Imperial Legion and the Stormcloak Rebellion traveled to the isolated stone sanctuary of the Greybeards near the mountain's summit. They sat at a long stone table, heavily guarded by their respective armored escorts. The Dragonborn stood at the head of the table, facilitating the difficult negotiations. The physical exchanges of territory and the establishment of new, temporary borders allowed the Dragonborn the time and resources required to finally isolate and destroy Alduin on the highest peak, temporarily pausing the civil war and allowing the remaining human soldiers to clear the thousands of bodies from the frozen valleys. The human builders positioned a massive stone structure named Fort Dawnguard inside a narrow canyon in the western mountains of Skyrim. A human named Isran stood in the circular dirt courtyard, handing heavy steel crossbows to arriving recruits. These human recruits strapped thick layers of boiled leather over their torsos and loaded silver-tipped metal bolts into wooden quivers. They stacked bundles of dried wood and iron stakes against the stone barricades, organizing a specialized military force dedicated to hunting the pale-skinned humanoids infesting the dark caverns of the province. Far to the northwest, the towering stone walls of Castle Volkihar occupied a jagged island in the freezing ocean. Inside the central dining hall, vampires with pale, translucent skin and glowing yellow eyes consumed thick red blood from polished silver goblets. Their leader, Harkon, stood at the head of a long wooden table. He possessed elongated bone fangs protruding from his upper jaw and folded large, leathery, bat-like wings against his spine. Harkon distributed forged iron weapons to his followers, instructing them to capture specific individuals carrying ancient, glowing parchment scrolls. He planned to extract the biological blood from his own daughter, apply the fluid to an elven arrow, and fire the projectile directly into the sun to cast a permanent, physical shadow over the entire continent. The Dragonborn traveled to the island fortress, marching across the stone access bridge alongside the armored Dawnguard recruits. The human soldiers raised their heavy steel crossbows and fired volleys of silver-tipped bolts. The projectiles punctured the pale skin of the vampires, releasing bursts of thermal energy that incinerated the biological tissue of the defenders. The Dragonborn pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral and engaged Harkon on the marble floor. Harkon lifted his boots off the tiles, hovering in the air and projecting streams of red thermal magic from his fingertips. The Dragonborn gripped a specialized bow carved from solid white crystal, pulled the string back, and released a glowing white arrow. The projectile struck the center of Harkon's chest, emitting a concentrated beam of solar energy that burned a wide hole through his torso. The intense light reduced the vampire's physical body to a pile of grey ash on the stone floor. Subsequently, human cultists wearing carved wooden masks approached the Dragonborn on the mainland roads. These cultists wore thick robes woven from brown fibers and threw spheres of burning gas at the armored warrior. The Dragonborn swung a heavy steel broadsword, severing the limbs of the cultists and splashing red blood across the packed dirt. The Dragonborn searched the bodies, retrieving a rolled parchment, directing them eastward to the island of Solstheim. The Dragonborn boarded a wooden galleon, and the sailors steered the vessel across the freezing ocean swells until they reached the distant docks. Thick grey ash from the constant eruptions of Red Mountain covered the coastal settlement of Raven Rock. The Dragonborn walked past the wooden docks and observed local human and elven workers striking the grey dirt with iron pickaxes. The workers dug circular trenches around massive, glowing green stone pillars protruding from the topsoil. A human male named Mirak projected continuous auditory frequencies from a distant location, physically manipulating the brain chemistry of the workers and commanding their physical labor. The workers chanted synchronized syllables, their eyes glowing with a faint green light as they stacked loose rocks against the base of the pillars. To reach Mirak, the Dragonborn retrieved a heavy, leather-bound book radiating dense green energy. The Dragonborn opened the thick cover and pressed their hands against the parchment pages. The green energy pulled the Dragonborn's physical body through a spatial tear, dropping them onto a pathway of stacked leather books inside an oblivion chasm designated Apocrypha. Rivers of thick, bubbling green acid flowed slowly between towering vertical walls constructed entirely of paper and parchment. Enormous dark green tentacles, covered in thick suction cups, emerged from the acidic rivers, slapping against the paper towers and dragging heavy stacks of books down into the liquid. Mirak stood on a wide, circular platform constructed of bound parchment suspended directly over the central pool of acid. He wore a heavy bronze mask featuring narrow vertical slits and gripped a long, jagged sword forged from dark metal. He inhaled the humid green vapor and expelled a concussive vocalization at the Dragonborn. The sound waves struck the Dragonborn's steel armor, pushing their boots backward across the paper floor. The Dragonborn leaned forward into the kinetic pressure, advanced across the platform, and swung the steel broadsword. The metal blade struck Mirak's bronze armor, shedding bright sparks into the air. The two combatants exchanged heavy physical blows, cutting deep lacerations into each other's flesh and spraying blood across the floating parchment pages. A massive entity composed entirely of floating green tentacles and clustered yellow eyes rose from the central pool of acid. The entity extended a sharp, barbed appendage, driving the spike directly through Mirak's torso. The thick tentacle coiled around the bleeding warrior, pulling Mirak's body downward and submerging him completely in the bubbling green liquid. The Dragonborn absorbed the glowing orange essence released from the surface of the pool, turning their back on the acid and pressing their palm against a floating book. The glowing green portal pulled the Dragonborn back onto the ash-covered rocks of Solstheim, leaving them to sheathe their heavy steel sword, while far to the south, the human and elven empires continued stockpiling heavy iron weapons and stacking limestone blocks to repair their shattered fortresses, preparing to hurl their armored infantries into a second massive physical clash over the remaining continental borders. The Ultima agents, designated as the Thalmor, walked across the paved roads of Cyrodiil and the frozen dirt tracks of Skyrim. They wore long robes of black silk embroidered with thick gold thread and carried curved swords forged from volcanic glass. They rode heavily muscled black horses, holding rolled parchment scrolls containing specific lists of human names. A detachment of these agents dismounted outside a wooden farmhouse in the northern pine forests. They kicked the heavy oak door, splintering the wood around the iron hinges. They entered the dwelling, pulling the human occupants out of their wool beds and pushing them onto the dirt floor. The Thalmor drove their glass daggers into the wooden floorboards, prying the planks apart to expose a hidden cellar. They extracted a small iron statue of the human deity Talos from the dirt cavity. They dragged the human farmer out into the snow, forced him onto his knees, and swung a glass sword through his neck. The thick blood sprayed across the white snow, melting the ice. The agents threw burning torches onto the thatched roof of the farmhouse, igniting the dry straw and walking away as the structure collapsed into a pile of burning timber. A column of Imperial Legion soldiers stood on a nearby stone ridge, observing the execution and the burning farmhouse. These human soldiers wore heavy steel chest plates and carried tall wooden shields bearing the red diamond insignia of the Empire. They gripped the leather-wrapped handles of their broadswords, tightening their jaws and grinding their teeth together. Their commanding officer raised his iron gauntleted hand and pointed to a rolled parchment sealed with the Emperor's red wax, physically instructing the soldiers to maintain their current positions on the ridge. The soldiers sheathed their weapons and turned their backs on the rising smoke, marching southward toward the Imperial city. Inside the high stone walls of the capital, the Emperor directed a massive physical mobilization of resources. Human miners deep within the Colovian mountains struck the rock with iron pickaxes, extracting tons of raw iron ore. Draft horses dragged heavy wooden carts filled with this ore down the mountain paths and through the city gates. The Imperial blacksmiths shoveled piles of black coal into massive brick furnaces, pulling heavy leather bellows to feed oxygen into the flames. They melted the iron, poured the glowing liquid metal into stone molds, and hammered the cooling steel on heavy anvils. They stacked uniform steel swords, iron-tipped spears, and interlocking armor plates inside the damp subterranean armories of the White Gold Tower, outfitting a new generation of infantry for the upcoming physical conflict. To the west, across the arid expanse of the Alika Desert, the human population of Red Guards initiated their own physical fortifications. These humans wrapped their faces in long strips of linen to block the blowing sand and carried long, curved steel scimitars tucked into leather waist sashes. They hauled massive blocks of yellow sandstone across the dunes, stacking the stones along the southern coastlines to form towering, thick-walled fortresses. The Red Guard engineers dragged heavy wooden ballistae up the winding stone ramps, bolting the siege weapons to the flat roofs of the fortresses. They loaded thick wooden spears, tipped with jagged iron, into the firing mechanisms and turned the heavy wooden gears to pull the braided ropes taut. The soldiers stood at the edges of the parapets, scanning the rolling ocean waves and sharpening the edges of their scimitars with coarse whetstones. They stored barrels of fresh water and sacks of dried meat inside the lower levels of the fortresses, preparing to sustain prolonged physical sieges behind the thick stone walls. Across the ocean, the Ultima commanders of the Old Mary Dominion stood on the white marble balconies of the Somerset Isles. They wore overlapping plates of polished gold armor and pointed their crystal staffs toward the massive coastal shipyards. Below the balconies, thousands of elven shipwrights chopped down towering oak trees, using bronze saws to cut the heavy timber into long, smooth planks. They hammered thick iron spikes through the overlapping planks, constructing the curved hulls of massive new war galleons. Elven weavers gathered large volumes of flax, spinning the fibers into massive white canvas sails, and hoisting them up the tall wooden masts using complex systems of bronze pulleys. Inside the central crystal spires, Ultima mages extracted glowing blue crystals from the island caverns. They ground the crystals into fine powder and packed the volatile dust into heavy iron canisters. The workers loaded these canisters, along with crates of glass swords and thousands of bundled arrows, into the deep cargo holds of the newly constructed galleons. The Ultima admirals walked up the wooden ramps and took their positions at the helms of the massive warships. They barked loud, synchronized commands, directing the sailors to pull the heavy iron anchors from the sea floor and angle the white canvas sails to catch the prevailing ocean winds. The sailors pushed the massive fleet of Dominion warships away from the white sand beaches of the Somerset Isles. The wooden prows sliced through the crashing saltwater waves, aligning into wide, coordinated horizontal formations. The admirals turned the heavy wooden steering wheels, locking the rudders into place and aiming the entire armada northward, charting a direct, physical course toward the fortified coastlines of the human provinces. The Old Mary Dominion warships anchored along the southern and western coastlines of the central continent, lowering heavy wooden ramps onto the sand. The Ultima infantry marched down the ramps, wearing thick, overlapping plates of polished gold armor. They carried long glass swords and tall shields, inscribed with the golden eagle insignia. The elves advanced inland, bypassing the destroyed imperial border forts entirely. They targeted the major human trade hubs, utilizing concentrated blasts of thermal magic from their crystal staffs to melt the iron gates of the cities. The Ultima soldiers entered the settlements, physically removing the local human leaders from their stone keeps and severing their heads in the central plazas. The Dominion rapidly established heavily fortified camps across the southern provinces, driving deep trenches into the soil and erecting tall, spiked palisades to completely cut off the imperial supply lines. In the imperial city, the Emperor Titus Mede II reviewed the physical reports of the advancing elven armies. He ordered a massive counteroffensive, pulling every available legion from the northern snowfields and the eastern ash plains. The Imperial infantry marched out of the white gold tower, wearing heavy steel breastplates and carrying long wooden pikes. The humans collided with the Ultima columns on the flat, grassy plains of Cyrodiil. The fighting involved thousands of bodies crashing into one another, shattering wooden shields and denting metal armor. The Imperial soldiers drove their iron pikes into the gold-plated armor of the elves, while the Ultima retaliated with streams of liquid fire that scorched the human infantry lines. The physical conflict persisted for several lunar cycles without a decisive outcome. The massive casualties on both sides left the plains covered in broken bodies and shattered weapons. Eventually, the Ultima commanders ordered a focused assault directly on the Imperial capital. The Dominion forces breached the outer walls of the Imperial city, flooding into the marble streets and setting fire to the wooden merchant stalls. The human defenders pulled back, barricading themselves inside the white gold tower. The elves dragged heavy wooden battering rams to the central doors, striking the heavy bronze hinges until they snapped. The Ultima poured into the throne room, forcing Titus Mede II to physically abandon the ruby throne and flee the city through a subterranean sewer grate. The Dominion soldiers hoisted the Golden Eagle banner over the tower, marking their physical occupation of the capital. Mede gathered his surviving legions in the snowy northern valleys, organizing the remaining human infantry into highly mobile strike forces. He directed his soldiers back toward the capital, launching a coordinated, massive assault on the occupied city. The Imperial soldiers broke through the Ultima barricades, engaging the elves in brutal, close-quarters combat across the marble plazas. They drove their steel broadswords through the gold armor of the Dominion forces, clearing the streets block by block. The physical fighting destroyed large sections of the city, collapsing the stone walls of the residential districts and filling the canals with debris and bodies. The Imperial forces eventually pushed the remaining Ultima out of the white gold tower, pulling down the eagle banners and re-securing the central structure. Both factions, severely depleted by the continuous physical warfare, agreed to halt the fighting. Titus Mede II and the Dominion commanders met at a stone table and signed a heavy parchment document called the White Gold Concordat. This treaty required the Empire to completely outlaw the worship of the human deity Talos. The Imperial guards walked through their own cities, using heavy iron hammers to strike the stone shrines and metal statues dedicated to the god, dragging the broken pieces into the dirt. Furthermore, the treaty allowed specialized Ultima agents, the Thalmor, to physically patrol the human provinces. These agents wore black robes and carried curved glass daggers, apprehending any human caught holding a Talos amulet and locking them inside iron cages for interrogation. In Skyrim, a Nord named Ulfric Stormcloak observed the Imperial guards destroying the local shrines. He wore a thick bearskin cloak and carried a heavy steel axe. He vocalized loud, concussive shouts, physically demanding the immediate expulsion of the Thalmor from the northern province. Ulfric marched his local militia to the central city of Solitude, confronting the High King, Torrig. Ulfric inhaled sharply and expelled a massive kinetic wave from his throat. The sound wave struck Torrig, shattering his ribs and throwing his body backward against the stone wall. Ulfric stepped forward, drove his steel sword into the king's chest, and fled the city. This specific action triggered a full-scale civil war across Skyrim. The Nords divided into two factions, the Stormcloaks and the Imperial Loyalists. They engaged in continuous physical combat across the frozen valleys, swinging iron axes and steel broadswords, leaving the snow stained with thick red blood. The constant military focus on the civil war diverted all attention away from the highest, jagged peaks of the mountains. Deep beneath the packed snow of these isolated summits, the physical crust of the earth began to heat rapidly. The frozen dirt cracked open, exposing deep circular craters previously excavated during the Dawn era. The snow melted into muddy water, flowing down the steep inclines and exposing large, heavy mounds of dark, overlapping scales. The heavy wooden doors of a small, mountainside tavern pushed open, scraping against the stone floorboards. Outside, thick snow fell continuously through the dark pine trees of the northern province. The interior of the tavern smelled heavily of roasted venison, spilled mead, and burning pine logs. Human farmers wearing coarse wool tunics sat on wooden benches near the central stone hearth, holding thick clay mugs. A lone imperial guard in dented steel armor stood near the entrance, leaning against his wooden pike and watching the heavy snowfall block the mountain paths. Across the room, a Khajiit merchant, wearing a thick, fur-lined cloak, counted a small pile of circular gold coins on a scarred oak table. In the corner, an elderly human scholar unrolled a thick, bound manuscript across a wooden barrel. He gripped a sharpened quill and traced the lines of black ink detailing the physical timeline of the continent. He turned the heavy parchment pages, revealing detailed maps etched with the current, fragmented borders of the provinces. The map showed the southern jungles heavily occupied by the standing Altmer armies. It detailed the massive, scorched crater dominating the eastern ash plains of Morrowind. The northern snowfields were marked with overlapping blue and red insignias, indicating the ongoing physical combat of the Skyrim Civil War. The scholar dipped his quill into a small glass inkwell, adding fresh lines to the map to mark the locations of the recently shattered stone watchtowers and the newly erected timber palisades along the mountain passes. Outside the tavern walls, the heavy beat of leathery wings vibrated through the cold air. A massive frost dragon circled above the frozen tree line, its green scales covered in a thick layer of ice. The reptile opened its jaws and released a localized stream of freezing vapor that instantly crystallized the damp branches of the surrounding pines. The human farmers inside the tavern set their heavy mugs down on the wooden benches, pulling their iron axes from the scabbards at their belts and moving quickly toward the thick oak doors. The current state of the continent remained physically divided and highly volatile. The Central Imperial legions continuously trained new recruits in the stone courtyards of Cyrodiil, striking heavy iron practice dummies and reinforcing their steel shields. In the western deserts, the Red Guards sharpened their curved scimitars against coarse grinding stones, preparing for potential naval assaults from the Aldmeri galleons anchored off the coast. In the freezing northern valleys, the Stormcloak militias chopped down heavy pine logs, expanding their wooden fortifications and stockpiling iron-tipped arrows to defend against the returning dragons. The continent of Tamriel, shaped by the massive physical collisions of the Dawn era, the subsequent elven migrations, and the bloody rise of the human empires, stood heavily armed and deeply fractured. These are the events that established the physical boundaries and the diverse biological populations occupying the varied environments of the continent. The heavy stone ruins of the earliest settlements remain visible beneath the snow and the mud, their carved walls serving as constant reminders of the previous conflicts. The current human and elven factions continue to forge weapons, erect fortresses, and maneuver their standing armies across the contested plains, perpetuating the cycle of physical expansion and defensive fortification that has defined the entire recorded history of the physical world. The fire in the central hearth burns low, the glowing embers casting long, sharp shadows across the wooden floorboards. The heat radiates outward, warming the heavy furs and pushing back the freezing draft from the iron-bound doors. The steady sound of the falling snow hitting the thatched roof provides a constant, rhythmic drone. The detailed history of the continent, from the initial crystallization of the original spirits to the return of the massive winged reptiles, stands fully recounted. Settle deeper into the thick wool blankets and let the steady warmth ease the tension from the long journey. The surrounding mountain paths remain blocked by the heavy snowdrifts, and the physical conflicts of the world can wait until the morning light breaks over the freezing peaks.